The story of the Plantagenet dynasty does not begin with a crown placed upon a willing head, nor with a single decisive moment of triumph that established a new order cleanly and without complication. It begins instead in the tangled bloodlines, broken promises, disputed inheritances, and catastrophic ambitions of medieval Europe, where the concept of legitimate rule was simultaneously the most powerful force in human society and the most violently contested. The Plantagenets, who would govern England for more than 3 centuries, from the middle of the 12th century to the final years of the 14th, represented something that history rarely produces in such concentrated form, a family whose internal conflicts were indistinguishable from the political history of an entire civilization, whose dynastic quarrels reshaped the map of the known world, and whose successive generations demonstrated with extraordinary consistency that the acquisition of power and the capacity to hold it are entirely different and frequently contradictory skills. The dynasty's story is not simply a catalogue of battles won and lost, of kings crowned and deposed, but a sustained examination of what happens when extraordinary human ambition collides repeatedly with the structural limitations of medieval governance, when the personal failings of individual rulers have consequences measured not in individual suffering, but in the transformation of entire kingdoms and the redrawing of the boundaries of nations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. To understand the Plantagenets requires understanding the world into which they erupted, a world defined by the Norman conquest of England in 1066, when William the Conqueror crossed the Channel from Normandy and defeated the last Anglo-Saxon king at the Battle of Hastings, fundamentally altering the cultural, linguistic, administrative, and political character of the English kingdom forever. The Norman settlement that followed created a French-speaking aristocratic ruling class, superimposed upon an existing Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian population, establishing the peculiar dual nature of English medieval kingship, in which the monarch was simultaneously King of England and a continental feudal lord, holding territories across the Channel that required their own administration, their own military defence, and their own complex web of feudal obligations. This duality, England on one side of the water and vast territorial holdings in France on the other, would define Plantagenet politics for the entirety of the dynasty's existence, generating conflicts that could never be fully resolved because they were structurally embedded in the very nature of the kingdom's founding. The Norman kings, who preceded the Plantagenets, William the Conqueror himself, his son William Rufus, and then his younger son Henry I, established the administrative foundations upon which Plantagenet governance would later build a relatively sophisticated system of royal courts, treasury management, and centralized justice that distinguished English kingship from many of its continental counterparts. When Henry I died in 1135 without a surviving, legitimate male heir, the kingdom he left behind was administratively capable but dynastically unstable, and the consequences of that instability would be felt for generations in ways that transformed not just England, but the entire political landscape of Western Europe. The feudal system that underpinned all of medieval governance depended upon an unbroken chain of authority descending from the king through his great lords and down to the smallest tenant farmer, and when the apex of that chain was disputed, the entire structure became vulnerable to the centrifugal forces of local ambition, regional loyalty, and personal calculation that always existed beneath the surface of medieval political order. The death of Henry I without a male heir did not merely create a succession problem in the narrow dynastic sense, but threatened to unravel the entire administrative achievement of the Norman period, because the loyalty of every baron in England was conditional on their recognition of a legitimate superior whose authority derived from acknowledged royal right, and that recognition, once withdrawn or genuinely uncertain, could not simply be reinstated by proclamation or legal argument without the military and political foundation to back it. The particular vulnerability created by Henry I's situation reflected a broader tension in medieval political theory between two competing principles of succession that were never fully reconciled: the principle of hereditary right, which held that the crown descended automatically to the nearest legitimate heir, regardless of personal capacity or political circumstance, and the principle of fitness for rule, which held that the king's primary obligation was to govern effectively, and that succession should therefore take into account the candidate's ability to perform the royal function. These two principles existed in permanent theoretical tension in the medieval world, and the crises generated by that tension would recur throughout the Plantagenet period, providing the ideological framework within which successive constitutional conflicts were fought out and the justification through which successive depositions were legitimized after the fact. The crisis that followed Henry I's death is known to historians as the Anarchy, a period of approximately 19 years, during which two claimants to the English throne fought a devastating and inconclusive civil war that demonstrated with terrible clarity what happened when the feudal system, which depended entirely on uncontested hierarchical authority, lost its apex. Henry I had secured promises from his barons to support the succession of his daughter Matilda, who had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, and who, following her husband's death, had returned to England and then been married again to Geoffrey of Anjou, a powerful French count whose lands lay to the south of Normandy. Matilda was formidably capable, politically intelligent, and possessed of legitimate dynastic claims that were, by any reasonable standard of inheritance, superior to those of her rival. Her rival was Stephen of Blois, her cousin, a grandson of William the Conqueror through the female line, who moved with decisive speed following Henry I's death in November 1135 to seize the treasury at Winchester and secure recognition from the church and the English barons before Matilda could act. The choice between Stephen and Matilda was not simply a choice between two individuals, but a fundamental question about the nature of royal authority, whether the promises made to a previous king bound his barons even when honouring. Those promises might seem contrary to their immediate interests, and whether a woman could rule England in her own right when every institution of medieval governance had been constructed by and for men. The English barons answered these questions through 19 years of catastrophic hedging, switching sides repeatedly based on immediate military circumstances and local political calculations, creating a situation in which neither claimant could consolidate sufficient support to end the conflict decisively. Stephen's kingship possessed certain genuine qualities. He was personally courageous, generous in a manner that made him personally well-liked among the baronage, and capable of effective military leadership in individual campaigns. But these virtues were precisely the wrong ones for the situation he faced, because his generosity translated into a systematic inability to maintain the discipline over his baronial supporters that effective medieval governance required, and his personal likability made it difficult for him to impose the punitive consequences for disloyalty that were the only reliable mechanism for deterring further switching of sides. Matilda's personality, by contrast, was precisely calculated to generate the opposition that prevented her from consolidating the military advantages she occasionally achieved. Her arrogance, her inability to conceal her contempt for those whose support she needed, and her premature behaviour as a triumphant queen when she entered London in 1141 alienated the population and the magnates whose cooperation would have been essential for her coronation. And the opportunity that her capture of Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln had seemed to provide collapsed almost immediately under the weight of her political incompetence. The physical consequences of the anarchy for ordinary English people were severe in ways that the political narrative of competing royal claims does not fully capture: the disruption of agricultural production through military campaigning, the destruction of towns and villages by forces operating on behalf of both sides, the breakdown of royal justice that allowed local strongmen to exploit their neighbours without effective restraint, and the economic dislocation produced by the interruption of trade and the uncertainty of property rights created conditions of genuine hardship across large portions of the kingdom. The chronicler, known as the Peterborough author, writing in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle during this period, described conditions in which men said openly that Christ and his saints slept, a formulation that captures the sense of moral abandonment and divine indifference that accompanied the political collapse, and that reflects the degree to which medieval people understood good governance as a religious as well as a political obligation. The fortifications that barons constructed throughout this period, the adulterine castles built without royal license that proliferated across the English landscape, represented both the physical expression of the power vacuum at the kingdom's centre and the mechanism through which local lords attempted to create security for themselves in the absence of effective royal protection. These unlicensed fortifications, which contemporary estimates suggest numbered in the hundreds, became centres of local power that their baronial owners exploited to extract resources from surrounding populations through what the chroniclers described as the most brutal means: imaginable torture, imprisonment, and extortion practiced systematically and without any effective legal restraint. The anarchy thus demonstrated in the most visceral possible terms what the absence of effective central authority actually meant for medieval society, providing a negative template against which subsequent reformers and constitutional theorists would measure the value of good governance and the institutional safeguards required to maintain it. The resolution of the anarchy came not through military victory by either side, but through exhaustion and negotiation, culminating in the Treaty of Winchester in 1153, which recognized Stephen as king for the remainder of his natural life, while designating Matilda's son Henry as his heir and successor. Stephen died in October 1154, having reigned for 19 years and having left behind a kingdom whose administrative structures, while damaged by the Civil War, had proven sufficiently resilient to survive the crisis without permanent institutional collapse. The treaty's significance extended beyond the immediate settlement of the succession dispute to establish the principle that formal negotiated agreements about the royal succession, ratified by the magnates and the church, could provide legitimate mechanisms for resolving dynastic disputes without the complete victory of one party over the other, a principle that would be invoked in various forms throughout the subsequent centuries of Plantagenet rule. Whenever the question of legitimate succession became contentious, the anarchy established the conditions for the Plantagenet dynasty's foundation because it was Matilda's son, by Geoffrey of Anjou, the young Henry Fitz-Empress, who would later be crowned Henry II, who ultimately resolved the crisis and who stepped into the kingship as its undisputed holder for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Geoffrey of Anjou, from whose family the dynasty would take its eventual name, a name derived from the Latin Plantagenista, referring to the broom plant that was supposedly the emblem of the Angevin counts, had died in 1151, leaving his territories to Henry, who was at that point a young man of approximately 18 years already, demonstrating the extraordinary combination of physical energy, political intelligence, and administrative ambition that would characterize his reign. Henry had inherited Anjou from his father, Normandy from his mother following her claims there, and through his marriage in 1152 to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most celebrated and controversial woman in 12th century Europe, he gained control of Aquitaine and other territories that made him, before he was even King of England, the most powerful feudal lord in Western Christendom, controlling more territory in France than the French king himself. The Angevin Empire, as historians have called the territorial complex that Henry controlled at the height of his power, stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees and encompassed a bewildering variety of political arrangements: direct royal lordship in England, ducal authority in Normandy, comital power in Anjou and Maine, and the complex overlordship of Aquitaine, each with its own customs, legal traditions, administrative practices, and aristocratic cultures. The management of this territorial complex required political gifts of an exceptional order, and Henry possessed them in abundance, travelling constantly across his territories, personally supervising the administration of justice, and maintaining the kind of direct royal presence that was the primary mechanism through which medieval governance asserted itself against the centrifugal tendencies of feudal localism. Contemporary descriptions of Henry, his stocky, powerful build, his restless energy that made it almost impossible for him to remain still, his red hair and grey eyes, his preference for simple clothing that contrasted with the elaborate ceremonial dress of other rulers, and his habit of working through the night on governmental business, all suggest a man whose personality was defined by an almost compulsive drive toward activity and control that found its natural expression in the systematic reform of royal government. Eleanor of Aquitaine deserves particular attention because she was not merely a passive element in the Plantagenet story, but an active political force whose decisions, alliances, and conflicts shaped the dynasty's trajectory across multiple generations. She had been Queen of France before her marriage to Henry, having been married to Louis VII of France at 15 and having accompanied him on crusade in 1147 and 1148. The marriage to Louis was annulled in 1152 on grounds of consanguinity, though the actual reasons were more complex and involved the incompatibility of their political ambitions and the failure to produce male heirs. Within 2 months of the annulment, Eleanor had married Henry, creating an alliance that combined his military capacity and territorial holdings with her enormous wealth and the prestige of her Aquitanian lands. Henry II was crowned King of England in December 1154, ending the anarchy and beginning a reign that would last until 1189, making him one of the longest-serving and most consequential English monarchs of the medieval period. His 35 years on the throne were defined by a relentless program of administrative reform, legal innovation, and territorial consolidation that transformed the English kingdom's governmental capacity in ways that created institutional structures recognizable even today. The common law system that remains the foundation of legal practice in England and many of its former territories developed primarily during Henry's reign through a series of legal reforms that expanded royal courts, jurisdiction, regularized legal procedures, and created mechanisms for resolving disputes over land and inheritance that had previously been subject to the arbitrary decisions of local feudal lords. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166, the Assize of Northampton in 1176, and a series of other royal ordinances established the principle that the king's justice was superior to all other forms of dispute resolution and created the procedural framework through which that justice would be administered across the kingdom. The jury system, in something approaching a recognizable early form, emerged from these reforms as a mechanism for gathering local knowledge to inform royal judicial decisions, creating a participatory element in governance that would have enormous long-term consequences for the development of English political culture. The presenting jury that appeared under the Assize of Clarendon, a group of 12 men from each 100 who were required to present to the royal justices the names of those suspected of serious crimes in their locality, represented a genuinely novel mechanism for connecting royal justice with local knowledge, creating a system in which the Crown's authority to punish serious crime was implemented through local communities rather than despite them. The transformation of this presenting jury into the grand jury of subsequent legal tradition and the parallel development of the petty jury that determined guilt and innocence in individual cases created over the following century the jury system whose fundamental structure has persisted in English and American law to the present day. The Exchequer, the financial institution responsible for auditing the accounts of royal sheriffs and managing the revenues flowing into the royal treasury, was regularized and systematized during Henry's reign in ways that created the world's first genuinely sophisticated governmental accounting system, producing records of sufficient detail and reliability that modern historians can reconstruct aspects of 12th century English economic life with remarkable precision. The pipe rolls, the annual accounts of the Exchequer that survive in an almost unbroken series from 1156 onward, represent one of the most extraordinary administrative archives from any medieval government, and reflect the degree to which Henry's reforms created a bureaucratic culture capable of generating and preserving systematic records of governmental activity. The sheriffs who administered the English counties on behalf of the Crown were subjected during Henry's reign to systematic oversight through the general air periodic visitations of royal justices who travelled through the counties hearing cases, auditing accounts, and investigating local governmental conduct that created accountability mechanisms without precedent in earlier English governance. The Inquest of Sheriffs in 1170, which subjected the conduct of royal officials throughout the kingdom to systematic investigation and resulted in the dismissal of numerous sheriffs found to have abused their positions, represented an early example of systematic governmental audit that reflected Henry's understanding that effective administration required not merely the appointment of capable officials, but the creation of mechanisms for ensuring that those officials continued to behave in accordance with royal expectations, rather than pursuing their own interests at the Crown's expense. Henry's administrative reforms were accompanied by equally aggressive territorial expansion, including the invasion of Ireland beginning in 1169 and 1170, which brought that island nominally under English lordship and initiated a relationship between England and Ireland that would remain defining and frequently catastrophic for centuries. The Irish campaign was precipitated by the invitation of the deposed Irish king, Dermot MacMurrough, to Norman and Welsh marcher lords, who had used the opportunity to establish significant territorial footholds in the east of the island before Henry intervened personally to ensure that the conquests were made in his name rather than in those of his subjects, extracting submission from both the invaders and the native Irish kings in a display of royal authority that was more impressive in its immediate execution than it proved sustainable in its long-term administration. The most consequential and ultimately most damaging conflict of Henry II's reign was not with a foreign power or a rebellious vassal, but with his own Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, a conflict that illuminates with particular clarity the fundamental tensions within medieval governance between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence. Thomas Becket had been Henry's chancellor, his most intimate advisor, and by all contemporary accounts, his close friend before Henry appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 in the expectation that having his ally in the most powerful ecclesiastical position in England would allow him to extend royal authority over the Church in ways that his predecessors had been unable to achieve. What followed was one of the most extraordinary reversals in medieval political history. Becket, upon accepting the archbishopric, transformed himself almost overnight from royal servant to fierce defender of ecclesiastical independence. Resisting Henry's attempts to subject clergy to royal courts for criminal offences, and challenging what he saw as encroachments on church authority in a series of increasingly bitter confrontations that eventually forced him into exile in France for 6 years. The specific issue at the centre of their dispute was the question of criminus clerks, whether clergy who committed serious crimes could be tried and punished by royal courts, or whether they were subject only to ecclesiastical courts, which imposed penalties that Henry considered inadequate and that undermined the principle of equal royal justice. Henry's Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164 attempted to codify a set of customs defining the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical authority, but Becket refused to accept them as legitimate, and the standoff that followed demonstrated the limits of royal power when confronted by an opponent who could appeal to the highest ecclesiastical authorities in Europe, and who was willing to accept personal suffering rather than compromise on matters of principle. The personal dynamics of the Henry Becket conflict have fascinated historians precisely because the two men had been so close before their rupture, and the intensity of Henry's rage at what he perceived as Becket's betrayal reflected the degree to which personal relationships were inseparable from political ones in the 12th century court, where the king's household was simultaneously the centre of government and the primary arena of personal loyalty and patronage. Becket's transformation from royal chancellor to defender of ecclesiastical independence was not, in his own understanding, a betrayal, but a recognition of a higher obligation. His duty to God and the Church superseded his duty to the king, and the consistency with which he maintained this position through years of exile, negotiation, and eventual martyrdom suggests a genuine conviction rather than mere stubbornness or ambition. The political significance of the Becket dispute extended beyond the immediate question of clerical exemption from royal courts to encompass the broader issue of whether the English Church was primarily an institution of the English kingdom, subject to royal governance, or primarily an institution of the universal Church, subject to papal authority. Becket returned to England in 1170 after a formal reconciliation that both sides understood to be fragile, and immediately resumed his confrontational posture toward Henry's administrative arrangements. Henry's famous outburst conveyed the substance of his desire to be rid of his troublesome archbishop and prompted 4 knights to travel to Canterbury and murder Becket in his own cathedral on the 29th of December 1170. The assassination transformed Becket immediately into a martyr, created a political crisis for Henry that forced him to humiliate himself publicly through acts of penance, and ultimately resulted in the canonization of Thomas Becket in 1173, making the murdered archbishop a saint whose shrine at Canterbury would become one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval Europe. The 4 knights who committed the murder, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard Le Breton, appear to have genuinely believed they were acting on the king's wishes, and the subsequent papal investigation into the killing accepted that Henry had not directly ordered the murder, while holding him morally responsible for the atmosphere of rage that had precipitated it. Henry's penance at Canterbury in 1174, in which he walked barefoot through the streets of the city to Becket's tomb and submitted to a flogging from the monks of the cathedral, represented one of the most dramatic public acts of royal humiliation in medieval history, and reflected the degree to which the murdered archbishop's spiritual authority had eclipsed the temporal authority of the king who had caused his death. The political consequences of Becket's murder extended beyond Henry's personal humiliation to fundamentally limit the reform program he had been pursuing in ecclesiastical affairs, demonstrating that even the most powerful medieval monarch operated within constraints that could not simply be overridden by royal will. The shrine that developed at Canterbury following Becket's canonization became not merely a pilgrimage site, but an economic institution of considerable importance, attracting visitors from across Christendom and generating revenues for the cathedral establishment that funded architectural projects of extraordinary ambition. The rebuilding of the choir of Canterbury Cathedral following a disastrous fire in 1174 created one of the earliest and most significant Gothic architectural ensembles in England, and the elaboration of the shrine itself over subsequent decades reflected the enormous wealth that pilgrimage traffic generated and the degree to which the murdered archbishop's cult had become embedded in the fabric of English religious life in ways that would persist until Henry VIII's systematic destruction of the shrine in 1538. Henry II's reign ended not in peace, but in rebellion, and it was his own sons who provided the most devastating opposition he would face. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry had produced 8 children together, 4 of whom were sons Henry, known as the Young King, who had been crowned as co-king during his father's lifetime, in a procedure intended to ensure the succession, but which instead created a focus for baronial opposition. Richard, who would later become Richard I, Geoffrey, Count of Brittany, and John, the youngest, who would eventually inherit the throne after his brothers. The relationship between Henry II and his sons was one of the defining dysfunctions of the dynasty, combining genuine affection with systematic political mistrust, territorial jealousy, and the fundamental incompatibility between a father who refused to relinquish real power and sons who had been raised to believe they were heirs to enormous authority. The ceremony of the young king's coronation in 1170 was itself a source of conflict, because Henry had the coronation performed by the Archbishop of York rather than waiting for the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket was at that point in exile, and Becket's subsequent suspension of the bishops who had participated in the ceremony without his authorization was one of the immediate provocations for Henry's fatal outburst. The young king found himself in the extraordinary position of holding a royal title without any of the authority that title implied, dependent on his father for the resources to maintain his household and his position, surrounded by barons who were willing to encourage his resentment as a means of advancing their own interests, and increasingly convinced that his father intended to keep him in this humiliating situation indefinitely rather than genuinely preparing him for the responsibilities of kingship. The rebellion of 1173 had been remarkable, not only for the participation of Henry's sons and queen, but also for the degree of external support it attracted. The King of France, the King of Scotland, and various Flemish and Breton lords had all provided assistance to the rebels, reflecting the degree to which Henry's accumulated power and the territorial dominance he exercised across western France had generated a broad coalition of those who feared the Angevin Empire's continued expansion. The defeat of the rebellion demonstrated Henry's considerable military ability and the resilience of the administrative structures he had built, which continued to function effectively even while the king was personally engaged in military campaigns across multiple fronts simultaneously. The young King Henry died in 1183 during another rebellion, leaving Richard as the eldest surviving son, and Geoffrey died in 1186, leaving a posthumous son called Arthur, who would later become a focal point for further dynastic dispute. Richard then rose in rebellion against his father in 1189 in alliance with the French king Philip II, and Henry II died in July 1189, a broken man whose final hours were reportedly marked by the discovery that his youngest and supposedly most beloved son John had joined the rebellion against him. Richard I, who ascended to the throne in 1189, represents one of the most paradoxical figures in English royal history, a king who was almost universally celebrated in his own time as the embodiment of chivalric kingship, and who has been romanticized in popular culture ever since, yet who spent fewer than 6 months of his 10-year reign actually present in England, and who demonstrated through his extraordinary career that the qualities that made a man a great military commander were not necessarily the same qualities required for effective governance of a complex administrative kingdom. Richard had been raised primarily in his mother Eleanor's Aquitanian territories rather than at the English court, spoke Occitan and French as his primary languages, and regarded England essentially as a revenue source for his military ambitions rather than as a kingdom requiring his personal attention. His immediate priority upon becoming king was the organization and execution of the Third Crusade, prompted by the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin's forces in 1187, an event that had sent shock waves of horror through European Christendom and generated enormous pressure on Western rulers to respond with military force. Richard's preparations for the crusade demonstrated his remarkable capacity for military organization and his complete willingness to sacrifice any other consideration, including the stability of his English kingdom, loyalty of his administrators to the demands of his military objectives. He sold titles, offices, rights, and revenues with what contemporary observers described as cheerful shamelessness, famously declaring that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer willing to pay enough. The administrative consequences of Richard's fundraising methods were significant. The sudden availability of royal offices and rights at negotiated prices introduced a transactional element into English governance that complicated the administrative coherence his father had worked to establish, and the financial demands he placed on the kingdom before departure created resentment among the baronage and the broader population that his administrators struggled to manage during his absence. The coronation of Richard in September 1189 was accompanied by anti-Jewish violence in London and subsequently in York, where in March 1190 the Jewish community of that city, faced with a pogrom organized by local barons who owed them money and wished to escape their debts through violence, took refuge in Clifford's Tower and ultimately chose collective death over surrender to the mob. One of the most horrifying episodes of medieval English religious violence, and one that illustrated the degree to which the crusading enthusiasm that Richard's preparations had stimulated could generate domestic religious hatreds of a particularly brutal character. The Third Crusade of 1189 to 1192 constitutes one of the most intensively documented military campaigns of the medieval period, and one whose outcomes illuminate both the possibilities and the limitations of European military power. In the late 12th century, Richard assembled a formidable coalition force, sailed to the Mediterranean, conquered Cyprus en route as a logistical base, and source of supplies, and arrived in the Holy Land to reinvigorate a crusader siege of Acre that had been stalled for almost 2 years. His military achievements in the Holy Land were genuinely considerable. The capture of Acre in 1191, the subsequent march south along the coast to Jaffa under constant harassment from Saladin's forces, the victory at Arsuf, and the twice-advanced approach toward Jerusalem that on each occasion came close enough to the Holy City that individual crusaders claimed to have glimpsed it before strategic realities forced withdrawal, all demonstrated tactical intelligence and personal courage that justified his contemporary reputation. The conduct of the coastal march from Acre to Jaffa in particular reflects sophisticated military thinking to the maintenance of formation discipline under constant harassment from Saladin's mounted archers, the logistical coordination with the fleet that kept the army supplied while it moved south, and the preservation of the crossbowmen as a defensive screen that prevented the Muslim cavalry from disrupting the march, all demonstrated an understanding of combined arms operations that was unusual for the period. The massacre of Muslim prisoners at Acre, following the breakdown of negotiations over the terms of the city's surrender, was a decision whose military logic Richard considered compelling. He was preparing to continue the march southward and could not leave a large prisoner population behind that would require resources to guard and feed, but whose moral and political consequences were immediate and lasting, generating outrage in the Muslim world and complicating subsequent negotiations with Saladin. Richard negotiated a treaty with Saladin in 1192 that secured Christian access to Jerusalem as pilgrims and maintained the Crusader presence along the coast, then began his return journey to England. His return became itself one of the celebrated episodes of medieval political drama captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, whose banner he had insultingly torn down at Acre, imprisoned by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, and ransomed only after England had paid the enormous sum of 100,000 marks, approximately 3 times the kingdom's annual royal revenue, in 1194. The ransom crisis demonstrated both the enormous fiscal capacity that Henry II's administrative reforms had created. The kingdom was able to raise this extraordinary sum within a reasonable period, though not without considerable hardship, and the degree to which Richard's absence had allowed his brother John and the French King Philip to pursue their own political interests at the expense of the Plantagenet position on both sides of the Channel. John had attempted to seize control of the English kingdom during his brother's captivity, making agreements with Philip that surrendered important Norman territories in exchange for French support, and Richard's return required a combination of military force and diplomatic settlement to restore the situation to something approaching stability. Richard's brief return to England before departing for his French territories demonstrated that the kingdom had been administered during his absence with reasonable competence by his justiciars, particularly Hubert Walter, who proved one of the most capable administrators of the medieval English state. The institutional resilience that allowed England to function effectively during Richard's prolonged absence and the crisis of his captivity represented the ultimate vindication of the administrative reforms Henry II had implemented, a governmental machine sufficiently developed that it did not depend on the king's personal daily involvement to continue operating. Hubert Walter's administration of England during Richard's final years demonstrated the degree to which the permanent bureaucratic offices of the Crown, the Chancery, the Exchequer, the royal courts had developed the institutional independence required to maintain continuity of governance, regardless of the monarch's personal attention or presence. Richard spent the remaining 5 years of his reign campaigning in France against Philip II, attempting to recover territories and influence that had been lost during his crusade and imprisonment, and constructing the remarkable military fortification of Château Gaillard on the Seine as both a strategic stronghold, demonstration of his extraordinary talent for military engineering. He died in March 1199 from a crossbow bolt wound received during a minor siege in the Limousin, a wound that had seemed initially minor but became infected, and with his death, the Plantagenet succession entered its most complex and destructive phase. John's reign, which lasted from 1199 to 1216 is among the most consistently catastrophic in English royal history, though assessing it fairly requires acknowledging that John faced structural problems, not entirely of his own making, even as his personal failures of judgment, temperament, and political intelligence made those problems vastly worse than they needed to be. The loss of Normandy and the other northern French territories in 1204 represented the most significant territorial catastrophe in English history to that point. Reducing the King of England from the dominant territorial power in western France to a monarch whose continental holdings were confined to Gascony in the southwest. The loss was precipitated by a combination of Philip II's strategic brilliance, John's military failures, and the political consequences of John's treatment of Arthur of Brittany, who had been captured in 1202 and who disappeared shortly afterward, almost certainly murdered on John's orders, an act that alienated the Norman and Angevin barons whose loyalty was essential for the defence of those territories, and that gave Philip the political justification for declaring John's continental fiefs forfeit. Philip II of France was one of the most formidable monarchs in medieval European history, a ruler who combined military ability with a patient, systematic approach to expanding Capetian royal authority at the expense of the Plantagenet Empire, and whose understanding of feudal law and political manipulation allowed him to exploit every weakness in John's position with devastating effectiveness. The character of John's kingship, as perceived by his contemporaries, combined genuine administrative capability with a personal temperament that contemporaries found simultaneously suspicious, vindictive, and unreliable. His capacity for sudden violence, his willingness to use hostages and arbitrary imprisonment as tools of political coercion, and his systematic exploitation of every available fiscal mechanism created a climate of fear within the baronage that gradually transformed specific grievances into a more fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of his rule. The starvation of Matilda de Braose and her son in Windsor Castle, members of a powerful Welsh Marcher family who had fallen from royal favour and been treated as hostages to ensure their husband and father's compliance, represented one of the most notorious acts of royal cruelty in the Plantagenet period, and generated horror among the baronage that no subsequent political settlement could entirely overcome. The loss of Normandy had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military and territorial dimensions. It forced a fundamental reorientation of English royal identity and policy for the first time since 1066. The King of England could not simply move his court and his household across the Channel to govern his French territories personally, and the Norman baronage that had straddled both sides of the water was forced to choose between their English and French allegiances. This choice, playing out over years rather than in a single moment, gradually created a more distinctively English aristocracy whose primary political focus was on the island kingdom rather than on continental feudal relationships. The cultural consequences of this reorientation were also significant. The gradual decline of French as the primary language of the English royal court and nobility accelerated in the 13th century as the connections between the English aristocracy and their former French properties weakened, contributing to the eventual emergence of English as the language of governance and culture that Chaucer's work in the late 14th century would represent. John's attempts to recover the lost territories generated the financial pressures that would ultimately destroy his relationship with his barons and produce the constitutional crisis of 1215. The costs of military campaigning in France required revenue far exceeding what the conventional feudal dues and royal estates could provide, and John exploited every available mechanism of royal finance with an enthusiasm that his contemporaries found oppressive. Scutage payments made by knights in lieu of personal military service was imposed with unprecedented frequency. Reliefs payments made by heirs to inherit their estates were set at ruinous levels. Wardships, marriages, and other feudal incidents that gave the crown control over the assets of minors and widows were exploited systematically. Forest law, which restricted the use of royal forest land and imposed heavy fines for violations, was enforced with unusual strictness and extended to cover areas that the barons disputed should be classified as royal forest. The cumulative effect of these financial pressures was the gradual alienation of the baronage, not merely as a class of dissatisfied nobles, with specific grievances, but as a political community convinced that John's exercise of royal power was fundamentally contrary to the customs and expectations of legitimate kingship. John's dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, which led to the papal interdict placed on England from 1208 to 1214, during which church bells fell silent, church services were suspended, and the ordinary rituals of Christian life were denied to the English population, and added a religious dimension to the political crisis, and ultimately resulted in John's submission to the papacy in 12, his acceptance of England as a papal fief, and his formal recognition of Innocent as his overlord, a humiliation that damaged his standing with the baronage, even as it resolved the ecclesiastical dispute. The outbreak of open rebellion in 1215, following the failure of the Poitou campaign of 1214, which had been intended to recover the northern French territories and which ended in military disaster, brought the crisis to its decisive point. The rebel barons, operating with greater organizational coherence than previous opposition movements, drafted a document setting out their demands for reform of royal government, and John, finding himself militarily outmaneuvered and diplomatically isolated, agreed to seal this document, later known as Magna Carta, at Runnymede in June 1215. Magna Carta, the Great Charter, is perhaps the most celebrated constitutional document in the English-speaking world's political tradition. Though its immediate historical context and the intentions of its authors were considerably less elevated than the significance subsequently attributed to it. The Charter was in its immediate form a peace agreement between a king and his rebellious barons, a negotiated settlement of specific feudal grievances rather than a principled declaration of universal liberties. Many of its 63 clauses addressed highly specific matters of feudal administration, the rates of reliefs, the management of wardships, the restoration of unjustly seized lands and rights, the behavior of royal officials that reflect the particular complaints of the baronial class, rather than any broader program of political reform. Yet certain clauses articulated principles of sufficient generality that subsequent generations could read into the meanings and implications that extended far beyond the immediate context of 1215. The famous clause that no free man should be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, or harmed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, provided a textual anchor for developing concepts of due process and legal equality that would be invoked centuries later in contexts the Charter's authors could never have imagined. John had no intention of honouring the Charter's terms. He immediately sought and obtained papal annulment of the document, invited French military intervention, and resumed military operations against the rebel barons. He died in October 1216 during this renewed civil war, leaving the kingdom in a state of considerable crisis to his 9-year-old son Henry. Henry III's reign, extending from 1216 to 1272, represents the longest reign of any medieval English monarch, and was characterized throughout by the tension between an increasingly sophisticated baronial political class and a king who combined genuine personal piety, aesthetic refinement, and a sincere commitment to certain ideals of kingship with extraordinary political ineptitude, financial incompetence, and a persistent tendency to surround himself with foreign favourites who alienated the English baronage. The minority government that managed the kingdom during Henry's early years was organised under the regency of William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, who was approximately 70 years old at the time and who brought to the regency a combination of military reputation, political credibility, and personal integrity that allowed him to stabilise the kingdom, reissue Magna Carta in modified forms, and negotiate the withdrawal of the French Prince Louis, who had been invited by the rebel barons and had controlled a significant portion of southeastern England. The expulsion of the French forces following the naval battle of Sandwich in 1217 and the land battle of Lincoln effectively ended the crisis that John's failures had created, and the subsequent reissue of Magna Carta established it as a permanent element of English constitutional practice. Henry III's personal rule which began effectively in 1234, was distinguished from the start by the king's passionate investment in the arts and architecture, which produced some of the finest examples of English Gothic building, including the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey begun in 1245, which remains one of the supreme achievements of English medieval architecture. The rebuilding of Westminster Abbey was Henry's greatest personal project, an expression of his devotion to the cult of Edward the Confessor, whose remains were enshrined in the new building, and of his ambition to create a royal mausoleum that would rival the greatest Gothic buildings of the French royal house at Saint-Denis. Henry devoted enormous personal attention to the details of the abbey's design and construction, importing craftsmen from France, specifying the decorative programs of individual chapels and altars, and ensuring that the quality of materials and workmanship met the highest standards available anywhere in 13th century Europe. The result was a building that represented the most ambitious Gothic architectural achievement in England to that date, and that has remained the ceremonial heart of English royal life, the place of coronations, royal weddings, and royal burials from Henry's own time to the present. Henry's marriage in 1236 to Eleanor of Provence brought into England a network of her Savoyard relatives who received substantial royal patronage, generating baronial resentment that would eventually contribute to political crisis. His management of foreign policy was marked by expensive failures, and the extraordinarily ill-conceived Sicilian business of 1254, in which Henry accepted the offer of the Sicilian throne for his son Edmund from a pope who was seeking to displace the Hohenstaufen dynasty, committed England to military and financial obligations it could not meet. The resulting confrontation produced the Provisions of Oxford of 1258, in which Henry was required to accept a council of 15 barons who would share governmental power with him and supervise royal administration through regular meetings of Parliament. Henry's subsequent repudiation of the provisions led to the outbreak of the Barons' War of 1264 and 1265, dominated by the figure of Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. At the Battle of Lewes in May 1264, de Montfort's forces captured both Henry III and his son, Prince Edward, placing him in effective control of the kingdom and allowing him to convene, in January 1265, what is often described as the first Parliament in English history in a meaningful constitutional sense, a meeting that included not merely the barons and senior clergy who had traditionally constituted royal councils, but also elected representatives from the towns and from the county knights. De Montfort's dominance lasted only until August 1265, when Prince Edward, who had escaped from his captivity, defeated and killed him at the Battle of Evesham. Yet de Montfort's political legacy outlasted his military defeat, because the principle he had embodied, that legitimate governance required the participation of a broadly representative political community, had been demonstrated in practice in ways that could not simply be undone by his death on the battlefield, and Prince Edward's own subsequent development of parliamentary institutions reflected lessons learned from observing how representative assemblies could generate the political legitimacy that mere hereditary right could not always provide. Edward I's reign from 1272 to 1307 represents in many respects the apex of Plantagenet administrative and military achievement. His legal reforms produced a series of statutes in the 1270s and 1280s that reorganized property law, restricted the church's accumulation of land, regularized the operation of royal courts, and created legal frameworks for landlord-tenant relationships that would remain foundational for centuries. The development of Parliament under Edward was equally systematic. He used parliamentary meetings as mechanisms for obtaining taxation from the broader political community, for announcing and publicizing royal legislation, and for gathering political consent that could legitimize major governmental decisions. The Model Parliament of 1295, which Edward convened to obtain taxation for his Welsh and Scottish wars, included representatives of the clergy, the baronage, the knights of the shires, and the burgesses of the towns, creating what later tradition would regard as the template for the representative assembly that subsequent parliaments would claim as their constitutional ancestor. His conquest of Wales, completed with the defeat and killing of the last native Welsh prince Llywelyn ap Gruffudd at Orowyn Bridge in December 1282, brought the Welsh principalities under direct English royal control and prompted Edward's construction of a spectacular chain of castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, that remain among the finest surviving examples of medieval military architecture anywhere in the world. Master James of St. George, the Savoyard military architect who directed the design and construction of the principal Welsh castles, brought to these projects the most advanced understanding of concentric castle design available anywhere in Europe, creating fortifications whose interlocking defensive systems represented the state-of-the-art in late 13th century military engineering. His campaigns in Scotland, which began seriously in 1296 with the invasion and defeat of the Scottish king John Balliol, and continued intermittently through the remainder of his reign, generated Scottish resistance that proved impossible to extinguish, producing the heroic resistance figures of William Wallace and Robert Bruce. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge in September 1297 demonstrated that English military supremacy was not guaranteed even against opponents who lacked the resources of a fully organised kingdom. Edward's devastating response at Falkirk in 1298, where the English longbowmen shattered the Scottish formations, effectively ended Wallace's military capacity. But the subsequent emergence of Robert Bruce as the leader of Scottish resistance confronted Edward with an opponent who combined personal military talent with the political credibility of kingship and the strategic intelligence to avoid pitched battle, while systematically reducing English garrisons throughout Scotland. Edward died in July 1307 during yet another Scottish campaign, his final years consumed by a conflict that demonstrated the limits of even the most systematically organised medieval military state when confronted by an enemy fighting on its own territory with the support of its own population. Edward II, who became king in 1307, was in almost every respect his father's opposite, disinterested in military leadership, politically incompetent, devoted to personal favourites in ways that generated catastrophic baronial opposition. The favourites who precipitated the political crises of his reign were not simply personal companions, but political actors who accumulated royal patronage at the expense of the established baronage. Piers Gaveston, elevated to the earldom of Cornwall and continuously restored to royal favour despite repeated baronial demands for his exile, was ultimately captured and killed by a coalition of barons in 1312. The disaster of Bannockburn in 1314, in which Edward's attempt to relieve the Scottish siege of Stirling Castle ended in the most comprehensive English military defeat since Hastings, to eliminated any remaining military credibility Edward possessed. The Ordainers, a committee of barons who had been granted authority to reform royal government through the ordinances of 1311, attempted a systematic restructuring of royal administration, but Edward's resistance to genuine implementation and his subsequent reliance on the dispensers, Hugh the Elder and Hugh the Younger, as new favourites who proved even more systematically rapacious than Gaveston, ensured that the reform effort collapsed into renewed conflict. The final crisis of Edward II's reign was precipitated by his queen, Isabella of France, who formed a political and personal alliance with Roger Mortimer and assembled an invading force that landed in Suffolk in September 1326, triggering a collapse of support for Edward remarkable in its speed and completeness. The dispensers were captured and executed. Edward himself was captured, forced to abdicate in January 1327, and was subsequently imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, where he died in September 1327, under circumstances that contemporary sources carefully avoided describing with precision. The regency government exercised by Isabella and Mortimer was itself marked by corruption and the accumulation of personal wealth through royal patronage. Mortimer's dominance was ended in 1330 by the young Edward III's personal seizure of power at Nottingham Castle, a dramatic coup in which Edward and a small group of supporters entered the castle through an underground passage and arrested Mortimer in the Queen Mother's presence. Mortimer was tried by Parliament and hanged at Tyburn, and Isabella was retired from active political life to comfortable confinement. living until 1358, but exercising no further political influence. Edward III's reign, from 1327 to 1377, was in many respects the most successful of the later Plantagenet period, characterized by military victories of a scale and prestige that restored the dynasty's reputation after the disasters of his father's reign. The 100 Years' War, which began formally in 1337, when Edward asserted his claim to the French throne through his mother Isabella, generated the defining military achievements of the Plantagenet period. The naval victory at Sluis in 1340 secured English control of the Channel. The Battle of Crécy in August 1346, where Edward's army, utilizing longbowmen in a tactical formation, proved devastating against armored French cavalry, inflicted a defeat of unprecedented scale. The subsequent siege and capture of Calais in 1347 gave England a military and commercial foothold on the French coast that it would hold for more than 2 centuries. The founding of the Order of the Garter in 1348 created a chivalric brotherhood, binding the English nobility to the monarch through shared honour and collective identity, rather than merely feudal obligation. The victory at Poitiers in 1356, won by Edward's son, the Black Prince, who captured the French king John II and brought him back to England as a prisoner, represented the apex of English military success in France and established the subsequent Treaty of Bretigny of 1360, in which France recognized English sovereignty over an expanded Gascony. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348 and 1349, killing approximately a third of the population in its first visitation. The demographic catastrophe created by the plague fundamentally altered the relationship between landlords and labourers, because the sudden, severe shortage of agricultural workers gave surviving peasants and labourers a bargaining power they had never previously possessed, allowing them to demand higher wages and better conditions in defiance of the traditional structure of feudal obligation. Villages were abandoned as their populations fell below the threshold required to maintain collective agriculture, creating the earthwork remains visible across the English countryside that archaeologists have identified as deserted medieval villages. The Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages and labour conditions at pre-plague levels, but was regularly enforced with insufficient consistency to suppress the economic forces working against it, and the social tensions generated by the plague's demographic consequences would eventually culminate in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Edward III's later reign was shadowed by the decline of his own physical and mental capacity and by the dominance of his mistress, Alice Perez. The Black Prince, who would have been his father's successor and who had demonstrated at Poitiers the military talent that justified his extraordinary contemporary reputation, died of chronic illness in June 1376, predeceasing his father by a year and leaving his own son Richard as heir to the throne. Richard II's reign, from 1377 to 1399, is one of the most intellectually complex, ultimately tragic, in the entire Plantagenet narrative. Richard was a sophisticated man who patronized poets, artists, and architects. It was during his reign that Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, that Westminster Hall received its extraordinary hammer-beam roof, and that the arts of the English court achieved a refinement that contemporaries compared favourably to the most cultivated continental courts. The Wilton diptych, that small and extraordinarily beautiful painted altarpiece depicting Richard presented to the Virgin and Child by his patron saints, represents both the quality of artistic production available to the Ricardian court and the particular character of Richard's personal piety. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 erupted in Kent and Essex in response to the imposition of a poll tax, brought peasant armies to London itself, saw the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury and other royal officials, and was resolved only by a combination of the 14-year-old Richard's extraordinary personal courage in meeting the rebels at Smithfield and the subsequent brutal suppression of the rising. His conflict with the Lords Appellant in 1387 and 1388 left him with grievances he never abandoned, eventually expressed through a systematic program of revenge that began in 1397. The execution of the Earl of Arundel, the imprisonment of the Earl of Warwick, and the exile of the Duke of Gloucester represented Richard's attempt to eliminate permanently the aristocratic opposition that had constrained him. His subsequent confiscation of the Lancastrian inheritance in 1399, when he seized the estates of the recently dead John of Gaunt rather than allowing them to pass to Gaunt's exiled son Henry Bolingbroke, converted Bolingbroke from an exiled individual grievance into a symbol of everything the aristocracy feared about unchecked royal power. Henry landed in Yorkshire in July 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, and the collapse of royal support was immediate and total. Richard surrendered, was imprisoned, and abdicated in September 1399. He died in captivity in February 1400, almost certainly from deliberate starvation or other imposed privation, and with his death, the direct Plantagenet line came to its end. The manner of Richard's death and the circumstances of his deposition generated a body of literary and dramatic reflection in the generations immediately following that testified to the profundity of the constitutional rupture. His removal represented the deliberate killing of an anointed king through slow starvation, whatever its political justifications, crossed a threshold of sacred violation that troubled the consciences even of those who had benefited from it. And the guilt that Henry IV reportedly carried for his responsibility in Richard's death was one of the defining psychological features of his troubled reign. Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, was the son of John of Gaunt and the grandson of Edward III, and his seizure of the throne established the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenet family as the ruling dynasty. The parliamentary procedure through which Henry IV's succession was legitimised attempted to paper over the inconvenient reality that Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, descended from Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, through the female line, had a technically superior hereditary claim to the throne. Henry IV's reign from 1399 to 1413 was dominated by the challenges of establishing his authority against repeated rebellions. Owen Glendower in Wales launched a remarkable, sustained insurrection that at its height controlled most of Wales and attracted French military support before being gradually suppressed. The Northumberland Percy family, whose military power in the north had been crucial to Henry's own seizure of the throne, turned against him when their expectations of reward were not met, culminating in the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, where Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, was killed fighting against the king he had helped to place on the throne. The continuing questions about the legitimacy of Henry's title provided justification for each successive opposition movement and created a structural vulnerability in Lancastrian rule that would eventually be exploited by the Yorkist challenge in the following generation. The Glendower Rebellion in Wales was remarkable for its sustained duration and for the political sophistication that Glendower himself brought to the cause of Welsh independence. His alliance with the Percys and his diplomatic engagement with France demonstrated an understanding of the strategic possibilities of his position that went far beyond the typical pattern of regional baronial rebellion, and his parliament at Machynlleth in 1404, at which he was formally recognised as Prince of Wales by representatives of the Welsh nobility and clergy, and at which diplomatic representatives from France, Scotland, and Castile were present, represented a genuine attempt to create institutional foundations for an independent Welsh principality that might have succeeded under different circumstances. Henry IV's own declining health in his later years, and the tensions with his son, Prince Henry, who led a council faction that at times appeared to be operating as a de facto alternative government, complicated the management of royal government and created the political uncertainties that Shakespeare later dramatised with such memorable effect. Henry V, who inherited the throne in 1413 at approximately 26 years of age, combined administrative seriousness with a military genius that he demonstrated almost immediately upon his accession. His campaign in France in 1415, culminating in the Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, where an English army, considerably smaller than its French opponent, achieved a victory of almost incomprehensible decisiveness through the tactical effectiveness of the English longbowmen, and the catastrophic misjudgment of the French commanders established him as the preeminent military figure of his generation. The specific tactical circumstances of Agincourt have been analysed extensively by military historians. The constriction of the battlefield between two woodland areas that prevented the French from deploying their numerical superiority effectively, the catastrophic decision of the French commanders to advance their men-at-arms on foot across muddy ground toward the English position, the devastating effectiveness of the English longbowmen firing into the compressed and immobilized French formation all contributed to a victory whose scale exceeded anything that could reasonably have been anticipated given the disparity in numbers. The cultural resonance of Agincourt in English national memory has been profound and persistent, feeding a tradition of underdog military triumph that has been invoked repeatedly in English and subsequently a British national mythology in ways that reflect the original victory's extraordinary psychological impact on contemporaries, who witnessed an exhausted, outnumbered army destroy one of the most formidable aristocratic military forces in Europe. The subsequent Treaty of Troyes in 1420, in which the French King Charles VI agreed to recognize Henry as heir to the French throne and to disinherit his own son, the Dauphin, represented the greatest apparent achievement of English royal ambition since the Norman conquest. Henry died of dysentery in France in August 1422, aged 35, having never been crowned King of France, leaving as his heir an 8-month-old infant whose two-kingdom inheritance required a level of administrative and political management that the minority governments of the following decade struggled to provide. The speed of Henry V's achievement, the negotiation of Troyes, the marriage to Catherine of Valois, the consolidation of military control over Normandy reflected a strategic urgency that Henry's own physical constitution apparently could not sustain, and the dysentery that killed him while on campaign demonstrated with brutal simplicity that the most brilliant medieval military commander remained vulnerable to the same biological realities that destroyed ordinary soldiers, regardless of the strategic brilliance of his broader conception. The infant Henry VI, who reigned from 1422 to 1461, and again briefly from 1470 to 1471, represents the ultimate expression of the structural vulnerabilities embedded in medieval monarchy. Henry VI was, by every contemporary account, a personally gentle, devout, and well-intentioned man who was entirely unsuited to the requirements of medieval kingship. The gradual loss of the French territories during the 1430s and 1440s, as the Dauphin reasserted his authority and benefited from the remarkable intervention of Joan of Arc, whose military leadership galvanized French resistance in 1429 and 1430, demonstrated that the Treaty of Troyes had been achievable only through the combination of particular military circumstances that Henry V had created and that could not be maintained by a government operating under minority conditions with divided counsel and insufficient resources. Joan of Arc's career, extending from her first appearance at the French court in February 1429 to her capture, trial, and burning at Rouen in May 1431, represents one of the most extraordinary episodes in medieval military and religious history. A teenage peasant girl from Lorraine who claimed divine instruction to raise the siege of Orléans, who succeeded in doing so against the expectations of every military expert of her time, who led the Dauphin to his coronation at Reims in July 1429, thereby restoring the sacred legitimacy of French kingship that the Treaty of Troyes had been designed to destroy, and whose subsequent career demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of individual charismatic authority within the institutional framework of medieval warfare. The loss of Normandy in 1450, following military disasters that reflected the deterioration of English military capacity and the effectiveness of French recovery under Charles VII's reformed military institutions, effectively ended the English ambition of ruling France. The political discrediting of the court faction associated with the peace policy, the return to England of unemployed soldiers accustomed to violence and plunder, and the financial crisis created by the costs of a war that had ultimately achieved nothing, created the conditions for the baronial conflicts that would become the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI's episodes of mental incapacity, which began in 1453 and recurred subsequently, created the conditions for the Yorkist claim to be transformed from a genealogical argument into an active political program. The Yorkist claim to the throne rested on the superior hereditary position of Richard, Duke of York, who was descended from Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, through the female line, precisely the Mortimer claim that had been suppressed at the beginning of Lancastrian rule, as well as from Edward's fourth son, Edmund, Duke of York, through the male line, creating a double descent from Edward III that was genealogically superior to Henry VI's single descent through the Lancastrian line. Richard, Duke of York, did not initially seek the throne itself, but rather sought to reform the disastrously incompetent Lancastrian government and to secure recognition as heir presumptive, given Henry VI's failure to produce children for many years of marriage. His protectorate during Henry's mental incapacity gave him a taste of governmental power and deepened the resentment of the Lancastrian court faction led by Queen Margaret of Anjou, who viewed York's influence as an existential threat to her son's inheritance. Margaret of Anjou, who had come to England as a 15-year-old bride in 1444 and who had spent the subsequent 2 decades attempting to compensate for her husband's political incapacity through her own forceful advocacy of Lancastrian interests, represents one of the most remarkable figures in Plantagenet political history, a woman who exercised genuine political leadership in a world that provided almost no institutional framework for female political agency, who built and maintained a military coalition through years of adversity and defeat, and whose determination to preserve the Lancastrian inheritance for her son drove the escalating violence of the civil conflict more consistently than any other single factor. The outbreak of armed conflict at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 began a cycle of military confrontation, political settlement, breakdown, and renewed violence that continued through successive battles over the following decade. The Battle of Towton on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March 1461, fought in a snowstorm in Yorkshire, was by the standards of contemporary accounts one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, with casualties estimated by various sources in the tens of thousands. The particular savagery of Towton reflected the degree to which the conflict had moved beyond the conventions of aristocratic warfare. Both sides had reportedly issued orders that no quarter should be given, and the pursuit of the defeated Lancastrian forces by Yorkist cavalry across the snow-covered fields produced a death toll that shocked contemporaries who had grown accustomed to the violence of the preceding years of civil conflict. The Yorkist victory was decisive enough to end the main phase of Lancastrian military resistance, with Henry VI fleeing to Scotland while Edward IV established himself as king in London. Edward IV's first reign, from 1461 to 1470, was disrupted by his falling out with Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the most powerful magnate in England whose military and political support had been crucial to the Yorkist victory. Warwick's defection to the Lancastrian cause, his restoration of Henry VI to nominal kingship in 1470, and his death at the Battle of Barnet in April 1471 allowed Edward IV to recover the throne and eliminate the Lancastrian line's ability to continue the conflict. Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London in May 1471, almost certainly on Edward's orders. The killing of a helpless and mentally incapacitated man, reflecting the brutal political logic that dictated the permanent elimination of rival claimants rather than the merciful alternative of continued imprisonment. Edward IV's second reign, from 1471 to 1483, was in many respects the most administratively competent governance England had seen since Edward I, a period of relative political stability, commercial development, and royal financial rebuilding after decades of intermittent civil war. Edward revived and expanded the administrative mechanisms of royal government, managed his nobility with considerably greater sophistication than his Plantagenet predecessors, built a commercial relationship with the mercantile community of London, that gave him both financial resources and political support that was relatively independent of aristocratic patronage networks, and demonstrated in foreign policy a pragmatic flexibility that reflected realistic assessment of England's actual capabilities. His death in April 1483, at the age of 40, was catastrophic for the Yorkist dynasty because he left as heir his 12-year-old son Edward, now Edward V, under the disputed guardianship of his maternal Woodville relatives and his paternal uncle Richard Duke of Gloucester. Richard Duke of Gloucester moved with decisive speed following his brother's death to intercept the young king's progress toward London, arrest the leading Woodville figures, and assume the position of Lord Protector. A council convened in June 1483 declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid on grounds that he had been pre-contracted to another woman before the marriage, making the children of that marriage illegitimate and disqualifying Edward V from the throne. Richard was then offered and accepted the crown, reigning as Richard III from June 1483 until August 1485. The two princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard Duke of York, disappeared from the historical record in 1483 and were never seen alive again, their fate unknown and their disappearance the subject of historical speculation that has generated more scholarly and popular attention than almost any other mystery of the medieval period. The historical debate about Richard III's character and culpability for the prince's disappearance has generated a literature of extraordinary volume and passion, with defenders of Richard arguing that the evidence for his guilt is circumstantial and that alternative perpetrators, including Henry VII himself, cannot be excluded, while those convinced of his guilt point to the consistent pattern of behaviour that Richard had demonstrated throughout 1483 and the obvious political logic of eliminating rivals who could serve as focuses for opposition to his rule. What is not disputed is that the princes disappeared during Richard's reign and that his reign's political legitimacy depended on their effective removal from the political scene, making the question of direct culpability somewhat secondary to the question of political responsibility. Richard III's reign lasted only 2 years and 2 months, ending at the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, where Henry Tudor defeated and killed Richard in battle, the last English king to die fighting on a battlefield. The details of Richard's final moments at Bosworth have been contested by historians, but the essential outline of the battle, the defection of the Stanley family at the crucial moment, the failure of Richard's mounted charge to reach Henry Tudor before the Stanley forces intervened, reflects the fundamental reality that Richard's 2 years on the throne had been insufficient to build the political base of loyalty necessary to withstand a challenge. Richard's death on Bosworth Field ended the Plantagenet dynasty in any meaningful dynastic sense. The remains of Richard III, lost to history for more than 5 centuries, were discovered in 2012 beneath a Leicester car park built on the site of the Grey Friars Church, where he had been buried following Bosworth, and the subsequent analysis of those remains confirmed, through DNA testing, their identity as the last Plantagenet king, providing an extraordinary direct connection between the historical record and the physical reality of the medieval past. Richard's reinterment at Leicester Cathedral in 2015 attracted an outpouring of public interest that testified to the enduring fascination that the Plantagenet story continues to exercise over popular historical imagination, drawing hundreds of thousands of people to observe the funeral procession of a king who had died more than 5 centuries earlier, and reflecting a collective recognition that something genuinely significant had ended at Bosworth. Longest continuous royal dynasty in English history, a family whose story encompassed the full range of human ambition, achievement, failure, and tragedy in ways that no subsequent telling can fully exhaust. The legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty extends across virtually every dimension of English institutional, legal, cultural, and social life in ways that make it one of the most consequential ruling houses in European history. The common law system that remains the foundation of legal practice in England, Wales, and the many jurisdictions around the world that inherited English legal traditions developed its essential character. During Plantagenet rule, the system of royal courts, jury trial, writs, and common law precedent that Henry II established in the 12th century created the institutional foundation for legal development over the following centuries. With Magna Carta and subsequent baronial constitutional pressure ensuring that royal authority operated within recognized procedural constraints rather than through pure arbitrary will. The jury system, the principle of habeas corpus, the concept of due process of law, the independence of the judiciary from direct royal control, and the procedural framework through which justice is administered in common law systems around the world all have their deepest roots in the administrative innovations of Henry II and the constitutional constraints imposed by successive Plantagenet-era confrontations between royal prerogative and baronial resistance. Parliament, as an institution, received its essential character. During this period, the bicameral structure of Lords and Commons, the principle that taxation required parliamentary consent, the practice of parliamentary legislation through bill and statute, and the developing convention that the monarch governed in and through Parliament rather than simply above it all, took their formative shape during the 3 centuries of Plantagenet rule. The particular English combination of monarchical executive authority and parliamentary constitutional constraint that would, eventually, through centuries of further development, degenerate the constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy of the modern period, has its deepest roots in the conflicts and compromises of the Plantagenet era and the political culture of every nation that has inherited or been influenced by English constitutional traditions bears the marks of those medieval conflicts in the texture of its governing institutions. The territorial boundaries of the English state were substantially defined during the Plantagenet period. The conquest of Wales, the contested but ultimately transformative engagement with Scotland, the loss of the northern French territories in 1204, and the continuing presence in Gascony that the 100 Years' War ultimately failed to maintain, all shaped the geographical and political framework within which subsequent English history would operate. The relationship between England and its immediate neighbours, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, was established in its fundamental character during this period in ways that would generate conflicts, accommodations, and transformations extending through the following centuries down to the present. The Welsh experience of Plantagenet conquest, the establishment of the Marcher lordships, the construction of the Great Castle chain, and the eventual legal integration of Wales into the English governmental system through the Acts of Union of 1536 and 1543, all had their roots in the military and administrative decisions of Edward I, whose ambition of a unified British Isles under English royal authority shaped the subsequent course of British history, even where his specific achievements proved impermanent or were substantially modified by later developments. The Scottish experience of Plantagenet aggression, the wars of independence that Edward I's claims generated, and the Franco-Scottish alliance that those wars produced, created a national identity defined significantly in opposition to English power that would persist as a defining element of Scottish political culture for the following 3 centuries, and whose echoes remain audible in the political debates of the present. The cultural consequences of the Plantagenet period are equally profound. It was during this era that the English language developed into something recognizably connected to the modern language through the work of writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, that English architecture developed its distinctive Gothic character through the great building programs of successive Plantagenet monarchs, and that the English royal court developed as a centre of artistic patronage and cultural refinement that attracted talent from across Europe and generated achievements whose aesthetic significance has endured far beyond the political circumstances of their creation. The religious history of the Plantagenet period established patterns and precedents that would resurface with transformative effect during the Tudor Reformation. The persistent tension between royal authority and papal jurisdiction, explored so dramatically in the conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket remained a structural feature of English governance throughout the medieval period, and the gradual development of English ecclesiastical independence from direct papal intervention, accelerated by John's humiliation before Innocent III, and by successive disputes between English kings and the papacy over appointments, taxation, and jurisdiction, created an institutional environment in which the break with Rome under Henry VIII had deeper historical preparation than the dramatic events of the 1530s might suggest. John Wycliffe's theological challenges to Orthodox Catholic doctrine in the later 14th century, which generated the Lollard movement that persisted into the 15th century and that anticipated many elements of the Protestant Reformation in its emphasis on Scripture as the primary authority for Christian belief and practice, and in its critique of clerical wealth and institutional corruption, operated within a specifically English intellectual environment shaped by 3 centuries of Plantagenet governance and the particular tensions between royal, baronial, and ecclesiastical authority that had characterized the English medieval state. The Lollard tradition, though suppressed through heresy legislation under Henry IV and persecuted intermittently throughout the 15th century, maintained an underground existence in certain regions and social groups that provided a continuing current of reforming religious thought, connecting the 14th century academic radicalism of Wycliffe with the popular Protestantism that would emerge in the 16th century. The military history of the Plantagenet period contributed innovations and experiences that shaped English military development for centuries. The deployment of longbowmen as a decisive tactical arm at Crécy, Agincourt, and multiple other engagements established a military tradition that influenced English tactical thinking well beyond the period in which it remained militarily relevant. The longbow itself, whose effective use required years of physical training to develop the musculature necessary for drawing the powerful warbow, represented a significant investment of human capital that the English and Welsh societies maintained consistently throughout the Plantagenet period, reflecting the degree to which military culture permeated the social organization of the communities from which armies were recruited. The castle-building programs of Edward I in Wales and of successive Plantagenet monarchs throughout England contributed architectural and engineering knowledge that enriched subsequent military construction, and the administrative challenge of organizing and supplying armies for extended campaigns in France developed logistical and financial capabilities in the royal administration that had lasting institutional consequences for the past development of the English state. The chivalric culture that the Plantagenet court fostered and participated in, expressed in tournaments, courtly literature, heraldic development, and the formal codes of aristocratic military behavior shaped the English nobility's self-understanding and social practices in ways that persisted long after the military conditions that had generated chivalry had fundamentally changed, contributing to the distinctive culture of the English landed gentry that would remain a defining feature of English society well into the modern period. The dynastic history of the Plantagenets also contributed something more intangible but equally consequential to the English political tradition, a series of constitutional crises whose outcomes gradually established the principle that even the most powerful king operated within recognized constraints, that certain governmental actions required the consent of the broader political community to be legitimate, and that royal authority could, in extreme circumstances, be withdrawn and transferred. The depositions of Edward II in 1327 and of Richard II in 1399, both achieved through parliamentary procedures that wrapped violent political reality in constitutional legitimacy, established precedents that would be invoked centuries later during the constitutional crisis of the 17th century, when Parliament confronted another king who believed in the absolute divine right of royal authority. The English political tradition's characteristic combination of pragmatic flexibility and institutional conservatism, its tendency to resolve crises through procedural adaptation rather than revolutionary rupture owes much to the patterns established during the Plantagenet period, when the kingdom's governing institutions were sufficiently developed to channel political conflict, but not yet rigid enough to be destroyed by it. The persistence of Magna Carta as a constitutional reference point reissued and reconfirmed repeatedly throughout the Plantagenet centuries, accumulated a legitimizing authority that made it something qualitatively different from the original document that John had sealed at Runnymede in 1215, a symbol of the principle that governance was subject to law rather than merely an expression of royal will, whose invocation in constitutional debates from the medieval period through the English Civil War and beyond testified to its enduring power as a touchstone of English political identity. The history of the Plantagenets is ultimately the history of a family whose ambitions consistently exceeded the institutional capacity of the medieval state they governed, whose internal conflicts generated political crises of sufficient severity to force institutional innovation, and whose successive failures and successes defined the character of English governance for all subsequent periods. From the founding crisis of the anarchy, through the administrative revolution of Henry II's reign, the constitutional confrontations of John's reign and the Barons' War, the imperial ambitions of Edward I, the catastrophic failures of Edward II and Richard II, the military glories and ultimate frustrations of the 100 Years' War, and the dynastic self-destruction of the Wars of the Roses, the Plantagenet story encompasses more political drama, constitutional significance, cultural achievement, and human tragedy than almost any comparable period in any comparable national history. The world that the Plantagenets left behind when the last of their line died on Bosworth Field in 1485 was unrecognizably different from the world into which Henry II had been crowned in 1154. More institutionally sophisticated, more legally complex, more culturally developed, and more politically self-aware, having been shaped by 3.5 centuries of extraordinary conflict between the claims of royal authority and the demands of the broader political community for participation in governance. That transformation, however painful and violent the process through which it was achieved, constitutes the essential Plantagenet legacy, the creation through conflict of the institutional foundations upon which subsequent English and British political development would build. Foundations whose influence has extended far beyond the island kingdom to shape the political traditions of the wider world, and whose story remains among the most compelling and consequential in the entire record of human civilization. The Plantagenets were not simply a royal dynasty in the conventional sense of a succession of kings connected by blood. They were the architects, often unwilling and frequently disastrous, of the English nation in its modern form, the creators, through their ambitions and their failures, of the institutional framework that would eventually generate the most influential political tradition in the modern world. And their story continues to resonate because the questions they confronted about the limits of power, the nature of legitimate authority, the relationship between individual will and institutional constraint, and the conditions under which extraordinary human ambition either builds or destroys, and the societies it seeks to govern, remain as urgent and as unresolved as they were when Henry II first began the transformation of English governance more than 8.5 centuries ago. The institutional foundations that the Plantagenet dynasty constructed through 3.5 centuries of conflict, negotiation, and periodic catastrophe did not simply vanish when Henry Tudor placed the crown on his own head at Bosworth in August 1485. They persisted, transformed, and continued generating consequences that rippled through English and subsequently British history in ways that make the Plantagenet period genuinely foundational, rather than merely historically preceding the developments that came after. Understanding the full depth of what the Plantagenets created requires examining not merely the dynasty's own internal story, but the mechanisms through which their institutional innovations, their constitutional precedents, and their cultural achievements transmitted themselves to subsequent generations and shaped the world those generations inhabited. The transmission of Plantagenet institutional achievement occurred through multiple channels simultaneously, through the administrative offices and procedures that continued operating regardless of which dynasty occupied the throne, through the legal system that successive generations of common lawyers elaborated and refined on foundations laid during the 12th and 13th centuries, through the parliamentary institution that had acquired during the Plantagenet period a constitutional identity sufficiently robust to survive the transfer of dynastic power, and through the cultural and religious traditions that had developed their distinctive English character during the centuries of Plantagenet rule. Each of these channels of transmission carried not merely institutional forms, but the political values and assumptions that had been embedded in those forms through successive constitutional struggles, creating a political culture whose characteristic orientations toward law rather than arbitrary power, toward consent rather than mere command, toward institutional continuity rather than revolutionary transformation, reflected the particular history through which English governance had developed, the administrative inheritance that Henry VII received from his Plantagenet predecessors was in many respects the most practically significant element of the Plantagenet legacy, because it provided the new Tudor dynasty with a governmental apparatus capable of managing a complex kingdom without requiring the kind of wholesale institutional innovation that would have delayed and complicated the establishment of the new regime. The Chancery, which had developed during the Plantagenet period from a relatively modest royal secretariat into the central office of royal government, responsible for producing all formal royal documents and maintaining the official record of governmental activity, continued operating through the dynastic transition with remarkable continuity of personnel and procedure, its experienced clerks applying established routines to the business of the new regime as they had applied them to the business of the old. The Exchequer, whose origins in the Norman period had been systematized and developed throughout the Plantagenet centuries into a sophisticated mechanism for auditing royal revenues and managing the crown's financial resources, similarly maintained its institutional continuity through the political upheaval of 1485, providing Henry VII with both the financial information and the revenue collection mechanisms that effective governance required. The royal courts of common law, the courts of King's Bench, Common Pleas, and Exchequer continued hearing the cases and applying the legal precedents that had accumulated throughout the Plantagenet period, their professional judges and lawyers carrying within their institutional memory and their law books the accumulated jurisprudential achievement of 3.5 centuries. The continuity of these administrative and legal institutions through the dynastic transition represented something historically significant, the demonstration that the English state had become sufficiently institutionalized that its operation was no longer dependent on the personal authority of any particular royal family but could survive the replacement of one dynasty by another without fundamental institutional disruption. This institutional resilience, itself a product of the Plantagenet period's administrative innovations, was one of the most important political achievements of the medieval English state, distinguishing it from continental polities where dynastic change more frequently entailed wholesale reconstruction of governmental institutions. The legal system that the Plantagenet period had created continued generating consequences that extended far beyond the immediate political circumstances of its origin. The common law's characteristic methodology, the derivation of legal principles from the accumulated decisions of royal courts in individual cases, creating through the doctrine of precedent a system of legal rules that grew organically from the resolution of practical disputes rather than from abstract legislative design, proved extraordinarily adaptable to changing social and economic conditions precisely because it evolved through case-by-case engagement with real problems rather than through the application of predetermined theoretical frameworks. The royal courts that Henry II had established as the primary forums for the resolution of disputes over land and other important matters had by the end of the Plantagenet period developed a body of substantive law and procedural rules of considerable sophistication, covering not merely the land disputes that had been the original focus of Henry's legal reforms, but an expanding range of commercial, contractual, and personal injury matters that reflected the growing complexity of English economic and social life. The development of the writ system, the formal legal instruments through which cases were brought before royal courts, had created a rich vocabulary of legal concepts and categories that allowed trained lawyers to analyze and address new types of disputes by analogy with established precedents, demonstrating the common law's capacity for internal development without requiring external legislative intervention. The legal profession that had grown up around the royal courts during the Plantagenet period, the serjeants at law who argued the most important cases, the apprentices who learned their craft by observing the courts in session, and the judges drawn from the ranks of the most experienced practitioners, had by the late 15th century become a self-reproducing professional community with its own training institutions, professional culture, and shared technical language that maintained the continuity of legal knowledge across generations and through political disruptions. The Inns of Court, those remarkable institutions in London that housed and trained the common lawyers and that had no precise equivalent anywhere else in medieval Europe, had developed during the Plantagenet period into something approaching universities of law, providing the systematic professional education that the increasingly complex demands of common law practice required, and creating a shared professional identity among the lawyers who would staff the courts and advise the clients of the Tudor and subsequent periods. The parliamentary institution that the Plantagenet period had created carried within its developed form the accumulated constitutional history of those centuries, and the ways in which Parliament continued to evolve during the Tudor and later periods reflected both the institutional framework that the Plantagenet experience had established and the particular constitutional assumptions that framework had embedded in English political culture. The Tudor monarchs, beginning with Henry VII and continuing through the extraordinary reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, used Parliament extensively and skillfully as an instrument of royal governance, employing parliamentary legislation to implement the most dramatic transformations in English, religious, and constitutional history: the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the establishment of the Church of England, and the various settlements and reversals of the Reformation period in ways that reflected their understanding that parliamentary authority provided a legitimacy for these transformations that mere royal proclamation could not fully achieve. The constitutional lesson that the Plantagenet period had repeatedly demonstrated that major changes in fundamental governance arrangements required the consent and participation of the broader political community to be genuinely stable had been thoroughly absorbed by the Tudor monarchs, who characteristically sought parliamentary authorization for their most ambitious governmental initiatives, while simultaneously maintaining strong personal authority over the direction of policy. The Parliament that the Tudors worked with was recognisably continuous with the Parliament that the later Plantagenet monarchs had used the same broad constitutional structure of Lords and Commons, the same procedural practices of bill and statute, the same fiscal relationship in which parliamentary grants of taxation were exchanged for royal attention to parliamentary petitions and grievances. But it was also an institution that had been shaped and strengthened by its Plantagenet experience in ways that made it capable of eventually developing from an instrument of royal governance into a genuine check on royal authority, and ultimately into the sovereign legislature that the Glorious Revolution, 1688, would formally establish. The relationship between Plantagenet constitutional history and the English Civil War of the 1640s deserves particular attention because it illustrates with unusual clarity the way in which medieval precedents retained genuine political relevance centuries after the circumstances of their creation had been utterly transformed. When the parliamentary opponents of Charles I sought historical and legal justification for their resistance to what they perceived as royal tyranny, they turned systematically to the constitutional struggles of the Plantagenet period, to Magna Carta, to the provisions of Oxford, to the precedents of royal deposition established in 1327 and 1399, and to the developing parliamentary authority of the 14th and 15th centuries, finding in this medieval inheritance both the historical precedents that legitimized their position and the legal vocabulary through which to articulate it. Sir Edward Coke, the greatest common lawyer of the early 17th century and the most formidable opponent of Stuart claims to absolute royal prerogative, built his arguments for the supremacy of common law and the constitutional limits of royal authority primarily on his interpretation of Plantagenet precedents, treating Magna Carta in particular as the foundational statement of English constitutional principle, and reading into it meanings that its 13th century authors had never consciously intended, but that reflected genuine values, embedded in the common law tradition that Magna Carta had helped to create. The parliamentary debates of the 1620s, 30s, and 40s, in which the constitutional conflict between Charles I and his parliamentary opponents was articulated, repeatedly invoked the medieval precedents established during the Plantagenet period: the right of Parliament to control taxation, the prohibition against arbitrary imprisonment without due process, the requirement that fundamental changes in governance arrangements required parliamentary consent, demonstrating that the constitutional history of the Plantagenet centuries retained genuine political relevance as a source of authority and legitimacy in a world that had changed almost beyond recognition in its economic, religious, technological, and social dimensions. The cultural legacy of the Plantagenet period extended through the Tudor and subsequent periods in ways that shaped the distinctive character of English literature, architecture, and artistic culture. The English literary tradition that Chaucer had established in the late Plantagenet period, vernacular literature of considerable sophistication, employing the English language in forms and at levels of complexity that demonstrated its capacity as a literary medium equal to the French and Latin traditions that had previously dominated educated English culture, created the foundation on which subsequent English writers built in developing a national literary tradition of extraordinary richness and eventual global influence. The particular qualities of Chaucer's achievement, his psychological sophistication, his social range, encompassing characters from every level of medieval English society, his formal mastery of narrative verse and prose, and his integration of continental literary influences with distinctively English materials and perspectives, established models and precedents that shaped the development of English literature through the 15th and 16th centuries and beyond. The poets and prose writers of the Tudor period who followed Chaucer, Lydgate, Skelton, Surrey, Wyatt, and eventually the extraordinary flowering of Elizabethan literature in Sidney, Spenser, Marlowe, and Shakespeare all worked within a literary tradition whose foundational characteristics had been established during the Plantagenet period, and the ways in which they engaged with, reacted against, or built upon that tradition reflected the degree to which the Plantagenet literary achievement had genuinely shaped the possibilities available to subsequent English writers. Shakespeare's own engagement with Plantagenet history, in the sequence of history plays extending from Richard II through the two parts of Henry IV and Henry V to the three parts of Henry VI and Richard III, represents perhaps the most significant creative engagement with the Plantagenet legacy in the entire history of English literature, transforming the political and dynastic history of the medieval period into a sustained meditation on the nature of power, legitimacy, and the relationship between individual character and historical circumstance that has shaped how subsequent generations understand not merely the Plantagenet period, but the broader questions of political life that period's history raises. The architectural legacy of the Plantagenet period, expressed in the great Gothic cathedrals, monastic buildings, and royal castles that successive monarchs had commissioned, and that the accumulated wealth of medieval English, religious, and secular culture had made possible, continued shaping the physical landscape of England long after the dynasty had ended, serving as permanent reminders of the civilization that the Plantagenet centuries had created, and as the architectural context within which subsequent generations lived and worshipped and conducted the business of governance. Westminster Abbey, rebuilt by Henry III in the 13th century and continuously elaborated and enriched by subsequent royal and aristocratic patronage throughout the Plantagenet and Tudor periods, became so thoroughly identified with the ceremonial life of English kingship as the place of coronation, of royal marriage, and of royal burial that its Gothic spaces provided the physical and symbolic framework within which the rituals of English monarchy were conducted from the medieval period to the present. The great cathedral buildings of the Plantagenet period, Canterbury, Lincoln, Salisbury, Wells, York Minster, Lichfield, and the many others that rose during the 12th through 15th centuries, represented the most ambitious constructional achievement of medieval English civilization, requiring the sustained investment of enormous resources and the accumulated technical knowledge of generations of builders, architects, and craftsmen. These buildings were not merely religious spaces, but the primary public buildings of medieval urban communities, the centers of communal identity and collective memory that housed the records of the past in their archives and the remains of the honored dead in their tombs, and the context in which the most significant rituals of individual and collective life, baptism, marriage, burial, the commemoration of the dead were performed, their persistence through the Reformation period. Despite the disruption of the religious functions they had been created to serve, and the destruction of many of the shrines and decorative programs that had made them centers of pilgrimage and devotion, testified to the degree to which they had become identified with something beyond their specifically Catholic religious functions, with the continuity of English civilization itself, and with the accumulated heritage of a culture that had invested its greatest creative energies in these extraordinary buildings. The economic consequences of the Plantagenet period extended far beyond the dynasty's own time in shaping the characteristic features of English commercial and agrarian development. The transformation of the English economy that the Black Death had precipitated the shift from labour surplus to labour scarcity that had fundamentally altered the bargaining relationship between landlords and agricultural workers, continued generating consequences throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, as the demographic recovery from the plague's initial devastation proceeded slowly and unevenly, maintaining conditions that encouraged the development of more market-oriented forms of agricultural organisation than the traditional manorial system had allowed. The enclosure movement that would become a major social and economic issue in the Tudor period, the conversion of common agricultural land to enclosed pasture, primarily for sheep farming to supply the expanding English wool and cloth industry, had its roots in the post-plague restructuring of English agriculture that the Plantagenet period had initiated, and the social conflicts that enclosure generated reflected the continuing tension between the property rights of landlords and the customary rights of tenants that the common law had been developing and articulating since the 12th century. The wool trade, that had been one of the primary foundations of English economic prosperity throughout the Plantagenet period, the export of raw wool and increasingly of finished cloth to continental markets, particularly in Flanders and Italy, generating the customs revenues that funded royal warfare and the commercial profits that enriched the merchant class of English towns, continued as a central feature of English economic life through the 15th and 16th centuries, and the commercial sophistication that the wool trade had generated, including the development of credit instruments, commercial partnerships, and international trading networks, provided the foundation for the more expansive commercial ambitions of the later Tudor and early Stuart periods. The social consequences of the Plantagenet period's constitutional struggles were equally profound and equally enduring. The gradual extension of legal protection to broader categories of the English population, the elaboration of Magna Carta's guarantee to free men into a more comprehensive principle of due process of law, the development of the common law's protections for property holders of various social levels, and the creation of parliamentary mechanisms through which the grievances of the knightly and borough-dwelling classes could be articulated and addressed, created over the course of the Plantagenet centuries a political culture in which the expectation of legal protection was more broadly distributed than in most contemporary European societies. This broader distribution of legal protection was not, of course, universal. The unfree peasant population remained largely outside the common law's protections. The specific provisions of Magna Carta applied technically only to free men, and the legal system in practice reflected the power and resources of those who used it. But the principle that governance was subject to law rather than merely an expression of arbitrary will, and the institutional mechanisms through which that principle found expression, created cultural expectations that proved extraordinarily durable and that shaped the political demands of successive generations who sought to extend rather than simply to maintain the constitutional achievements of their predecessors. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, with its demands for the abolition of serfdom and the extension of legal equality to all English people, reflected the degree to which the constitutional principles articulated in earlier aristocratic struggles against royal power had permeated sufficiently deeply into broader social consciousness to generate analogous demands from social groups that the original constitutional struggles had not been primarily intended to benefit. The rebels of 1381 invoked Magna Carta and the principle that no free man should be subjected to arbitrary oppression in ways that extended its logic beyond what its 13th century baronial authors had intended, demonstrating the characteristic dynamic of constitutional principles that their articulation generates aspirations that extend beyond the immediate contexts of their creation. The specifically English character of the Plantagenet constitutional tradition, its emphasis on the common law as the primary framework for political life, its development of Parliament as the institutional expression of the political community's participation in governance, and its characteristic combination of respect for established institutional forms with willingness to adapt those forms to changing political circumstances, had consequences that extended far beyond England itself as English power. And English institutional models were exported through conquest, colonization, and cultural influence to other parts of the world in subsequent centuries. The American colonies that English settlers established in the 17th century carried with them the constitutional assumptions and institutional models of the English tradition they had left behind, including the understanding of Parliament as the primary locus of legislative authority, the principle that taxation required the consent of the taxed through their representatives, and the common law as the fundamental framework for the resolution of disputes and the protection of individual rights. When those colonists eventually broke with the British Crown over precisely the issues of taxation without representation and the rights of subjects that the Plantagenet constitutional tradition had articulated, invoking Magna Carta, and the accumulated common law tradition as the foundation of their rights, they were demonstrating in a context that the medieval barons of Runnymede could never have imagined the extraordinary persistence and adaptability of the constitutional principles that the Plantagenet struggles had helped to establish, the constitutions of the American Republic, the subsequent constitutional traditions of the British settler colonies in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and elsewhere, and the constitutional models that British imperial expansion introduced throughout Asia and Africa all bore in their fundamental structures the marks of the Plantagenet constitutional inheritance, transmitted through the developing English and subsequently British political tradition in forms that remained recognizable across centuries of transformation and elaboration. The religious legacy of the Plantagenet period, through its contribution to the particular character of English Christianity, and through the precedents it established for the relationship between ecclesiastical and royal authority, shaped the trajectory of the English Reformation in ways that distinguished it from the parallel movements of religious change occurring in continental Europe. The Henrician Reformation of the 1530s, in which Henry VIII broke with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and established royal supremacy over the English Church, was not, despite the dramatic novelty of its immediate form, without deep roots in the preceding centuries of English ecclesiastical history. The tension between royal authority and papal jurisdiction that the Becket controversy had dramatized in the 12th century, the anti-papal sentiment that Wycliffe's theology had generated in the 14th century, the royal manipulation of ecclesiastical appointments and revenues that successive Plantagenet kings had practiced within and sometimes beyond the boundaries of canonical legitimacy, and the developing English ecclesiastical identity that had emerged from 3 centuries of distinctive English theological and devotional culture, all provided historical preparation for the specific form that the English Reformation took. The dissolution of the monasteries, which transferred the enormous landed wealth of English religious houses to the Crown and subsequently to the new Protestant gentry created by Henry's grants of former monastic land, had economic and social consequences that transformed the English landscape and the English social structure in ways whose full implications continued unfolding throughout the Tudor and Stuart periods and beyond. The great monastic buildings that the dissolution abandoned the ruins of Tintern, Fountains, Revolks, and dozens of other abbeys whose substantial remains still mark the English landscape became in the post-Reformation centuries objects of romantic contemplation that expressed a complex ambivalence about the medieval heritage, admired for its aesthetic achievements while being simultaneously understood as the product of a religious culture that the Reformation had supposedly superseded. the specific contribution of individual Plantagenet monarchs to the net product, development of English royal ceremony, symbolism, and the cultural construction of kingship created traditions whose persistence and elaboration shaped the character of English and subsequently British monarchy down to the present. The coronation ceremony that had been developed and elaborated throughout the Plantagenet period, its anointing with holy oil that distinguished kingship from mere political authority by conferring a sacred character on the office, its presentation of the regalia that represented the different dimensions of royal power, and its location in Westminster Abbey that connected each new sovereign with the accumulated weight of predecessors, crowned in the same space, maintained its essential form through the Reformation's disruption of religious, ceremonial, and the subsequent reconstruction of Protestant monarchy under Elizabeth I, surviving as one of the most ancient continuous ritual traditions in the world. The specific elements of the coronation liturgy, many of which had been developed or elaborated during the Plantagenet centuries, continued providing the ritual framework within which English and subsequently British sovereigns were inaugurated well into the modern period, connecting each new monarch through an unbroken chain of ceremony with the medieval past that the Plantagenet dynasty had so largely shaped. The heraldic tradition that had developed its systematic character during the Plantagenet period, the formal rules governing coats of arms, the heralds who administered the system, and the College of Arms that eventually institutionalized the management of heraldic records, similarly persisted through the dynastic transitions of the Tudor, Stuart, and subsequent periods, maintaining both the practical function of providing documented genealogical and armorial records and the symbolic function of expressing through visual language the social and familial identities that the aristocratic culture of medieval England had developed. The Plantagenet period's contribution to the development of English governance extended to the administrative practices and record-keeping traditions that created the documentary infrastructure of English state. The systematic preservation of governmental records that Henry II's administrative reforms had initiated the pipe rolls of the Exchequer, the close rolls and patent rolls of the Chancery. The plea rolls of the royal courts had by the end of the Plantagenet period created an archive of governmental documentation of extraordinary comprehensiveness and continuity, preserving the record of royal governance from the 12th century onward in sufficient detail to allow subsequent administrators and historians to reconstruct the development of English governance with a precision possible for few other medieval states. The establishment of permanent record repositories, the Tower of London, Westminster, and other locations where the accumulating documentation of royal government was stored and organised, created institutional arrangements for governmental memory that persisted through the dynastic changes of the Tudor period. Beyond, maintaining the continuity of administrative knowledge across generations of officials and providing the archival foundation on which both governmental administration and historical scholarship would subsequently build. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, but maintained and used as an administrative reference throughout the Plantagenet period, remained in active governmental use as a record of landholding and fiscal obligation far beyond the circumstances of its original creation, demonstrating both the durability of effective administrative records and the degree to which the English state had developed the institutional capacity to maintain and utilize documentary resources over very long periods. Contribution of the Plantagenet period to English military culture and military institutions extended beyond the specific tactical innovations of the 100 Years' War to encompass broader patterns of military organization and the cultural values associated with martial activity that shaped English aristocratic identity throughout the subsequent centuries. The tournament culture that had flourished throughout the Plantagenet period, the elaborate ceremonial competitions in which knights demonstrated their martial skills, competed for honor and prizes, and maintained the physical fitness that military service required, had developed during the 12th through 15th centuries from relatively informal and genuinely dangerous combat exercises into highly regulated ceremonial events governed by elaborate rules and surrounded by theatrical pageantry that reflected the developing sophistication of aristocratic culture. The tournaments function as a mechanism for maintaining martial skills among the aristocracy who provided military leadership, gradually diminished as the changing technology of warfare made traditional knightly combat less relevant to actual military effectiveness. But the ceremonial and social functions of tournament culture, the display of prowess, the competition for honor, and the articulation of aristocratic identity through controlled martial performance, persisted in modified forms through the Tudor and Stuart periods and contributed to the distinctive character of English aristocratic culture. The chivalric values that the tournament culture expressed, courage, loyalty, generosity, courtesy, and the service of justice, had been internalized by the English nobility throughout the Plantagenet centuries in ways that shaped their self-understanding and their behavioral expectations, even as the specific military practices that had generated those values were transformed beyond recognition by developments in military technology and organization. The educational legacy of the Plantagenet period extended beyond the specific institutions of legal education at the Inns of Court to encompass the broader development of English educational culture that the monastic schools, cathedral schools, and eventually the universities of Oxford and Cambridge had created during the medieval centuries. Oxford, whose origins in the late 12th century coincided with the early Plantagenet period, and Cambridge, which developed somewhat later in the 13th century, had by the end of the Plantagenet period established themselves as the primary institutions of higher learning in England, and had developed the distinctive collegiate structure that would define English university education for centuries. The colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, whose foundation occurred primarily during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries through the patronage of bishops, royal officials, and occasionally royal family members, created residential educational communities that combined the provision of systematic academic education with the formation of a shared intellectual and social culture among the students who would staff the church, the royal administration, and the legal profession of subsequent generations. The curriculum of the medieval universities, organized around the trivium and quadrivium of classical learning and extended into the higher disciplines of theology, law, and medicine, provided the educated elite of Plantagenet England with a shared intellectual framework and a common set of references that contributed to the cultural coherence of the governing class across the regional and social differences that might otherwise have fragmented it. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII destroyed many of the libraries and educational institutions that had maintained the continuity of learning in medieval England. But the universities survived the Reformation period and continued providing the educated personnel on whom the governance of the Tudor and subsequent states depended, adapting their curricula and their institutional cultures to the changed religious and intellectual environment, while maintaining the essential continuity of English learned culture that the Plantagenet period had established. The urban development that the Plantagenet period had stimulated through the growth of royal administration, the expansion of long-distance trade, and the stimulus provided by the demands of royal building programs and military provisioning had by the end of the dynasty created an English urban system of considerable sophistication, with London emerging as a city of genuinely European significance and dozens of provincial towns developing the commercial, administrative, and cultural functions that supported an increasingly complex national economy. London's growth during the Plantagenet period, from a significant but not exceptional trading city of the early 12th century to the dominant metropolis of late medieval England, with a population that may have reached 80,000 or more before the Black Death reduced it temporarily, reflected the concentration of royal administration, legal activity, and commercial exchange that the Plantagenet administrative reforms had generated. The city's distinctive character, combining the royal and governmental functions centered on Westminster with the commercial activity of the city proper, had been established during the Plantagenet centuries and shaped the subsequent development of London as a dual city governmental capital and commercial metropolis, simultaneously in ways that remained defining features of its character through the early modern and modern periods. The relationship between the Crown and the City of London that had developed during the Plantagenet period, the exchange of royal protection and commercial privileges for the financial support and loan facilities that the city's wealthy merchants could provide, established a model of Crown merchant relations that the Tudors elaborated and the Stuarts eventually disrupted to their considerable political cost, demonstrating once again the long-term consequences of the institutional and political patterns that the Plantagenet centuries had established. The specific contribution of the later Plantagenet period to English political thought through the constitutional struggles of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, through the development of parliamentary procedure and parliamentary claims to authority, and through the theoretical justifications that participants in constitutional conflicts developed for their respective positions, created a tradition of English political writing and political argument that would prove enormously influential on the subsequent development of political theory. The thought of figures like John of Salisbury, who wrote in the 12th century about the limits of royal authority and the conditions under which resistance to tyranny might be justified. The constitutional arguments developed by the baronial reformers of the 13th century, and the parliamentary claims articulated during the 14th and 15th centuries all contributed to an English tradition of political argument that emphasized the contractual and limited character of royal authority in ways that distinguished it from the more absolutist theoretical frameworks developing in continental political thought. This tradition carried through the Plantagenet period's successive constitutional crises and transmitted through the legal and parliamentary culture that those crises had created, provided the intellectual resources on which 17th century constitutional theorists like Coke and Selden drew when they articulated the parliamentary case against Stuart absolutism, and through them influenced the broader development of modern constitutional theory in ways that extended far beyond the specific English context in which that tradition had developed. The Plantagenet dynasty's story, examined in its full complexity and its long-term consequences, ultimately reveals something of fundamental importance about the relationship between political conflict and institutional development in human history. The constitutional achievements that the Plantagenet period bequeathed to subsequent English and global political development were not the products of deliberate design by far-sighted reformers who understood the long-term implications of the institutions they were creating. They were instead the unintended consequences of conflicts driven primarily by immediate self-interest barons seeking to protect their property rights and limit royal financial exploitation, kings seeking to maximize their authority and their revenues, ecclesiastical officials defending the independence and resources of the church, lawyers developing arguments to serve their clients, parliamentary representatives seeking redress for the grievances of their constituents. The institutional framework that emerged from the accumulated outcome of these conflicts reflected their characteristic dynamics, the tendency of neither side to achieve complete victory, the resulting need for negotiated settlements that each party could represent as consistent with its principles, and the gradual hardening of these settlements into constitutional precedents that subsequent generations treated as authoritative statements of fundamental principle. This pattern, conflict generating compromise, compromise generating precedent, precedent generating expectation, and expectation generating further conflict when violated, operated throughout the Plantagenet period with remarkable consistency, creating through its repeated iteration the institutional framework and the political culture that made the English constitutional tradition distinctive. The enduring significance of the Plantagenet dynasty in the broader history of human political development thus rests not primarily on the specific achievements of individual monarchs, though those achievements were, in many cases, remarkable, but on the cumulative institutional consequence of the dynasty's 3.5 centuries of governance, conflict, and constitutional struggle. The common law system, the parliamentary institution, the constitutional principle that royal authority is subject to law, the tradition of documentary governance and governmental record-keeping, the professional legal culture centered on the Inns of Court, the university system of Oxford and Cambridge, the architectural heritage of the great Gothic buildings, and the literary tradition that Chaucer's work had established, All of these represented genuine civilizational achievements whose value extended far beyond the specific political circumstances of their creation, and whose influence on subsequent human development was both deep and lasting. The Plantagenet story, understood in this full perspective, is not merely the dramatic tale of a dynasty's rise and fall, of kings crowned and deposed, of battles won and lost, though it is certainly that too, with all the colour and violence and human complexity that the medieval period so abundantly provides. It is also the story of how human institutions develop through conflict, how political cultures acquire their characteristic values and assumptions through the accumulated experience of successive crises, and how the unintended consequences of immediate political struggles can shape the possibilities available to generations far removed in time from the contexts in which those struggles occurred. The last Plantagenet king died at Bosworth in August 1485, but the world that the Plantagenets had created endured and continued generating consequences that remain visible in the institutions, the legal systems, the political cultures, and the constitutional traditions of nations far removed from the medieval English kingdom in which those consequences had their origin. In that sense, the Plantagenet legacy is not a matter of historical interest alone, but a living presence in the political and legal world that we continue to inhabit, a reminder that the institutions through which we govern ourselves and through which we seek justice and accountability carry within them the marks of their historical formation, and that understanding that formation is essential for understanding the possibilities and the limitations of the world we have inherited. The question of why the Plantagenet period produced constitutional innovations of such extraordinary durability and global consequence, while other medieval dynasties governing comparable kingdoms left far more limited institutional legacies, deserves sustained examination because the answer illuminates something fundamental about the conditions under which lasting political institutions emerge from historical circumstances that might equally well have produced very different outcomes. The particular combination of factors that made England under the Plantagenets an unusually productive environment for constitutional development included the geographical isolation of the island kingdom that gave its political conflicts, contained quality disputes that could be resolved through internal negotiation rather than by appeal to external powers, the relatively small size of the English aristocracy that made collective action among the baronage more feasible than in larger continental kingdoms, and the administrative sophistication that the Norman and Plantagenet kings had developed that gave the English state sufficient institutional coherence to survive crises that would have destroyed less developed polities, while simultaneously creating the bureaucratic and legal machinery that gave constitutional principles practical expression. The interaction of these structural factors with the specific personalities and decisions of individual monarchs and their opponents generated the particular constitutional history of the Plantagenet period, a history that was neither the inevitable product of impersonal structural forces nor the mere result of individual choices, but the complex outcome of their interaction in circumstances that were genuinely contingent and that might easily have developed along very different lines. The role of the English Church in the Plantagenet constitutional story deserves more attention than it sometimes receives in accounts that focus primarily on the conflicts between kings and barons. The Church was not merely a passive backdrop to the constitutional struggles of the period, but an active participant whose institutional interests, intellectual resources, and moral authority shaped the character of those struggles in fundamental ways. The senior clergy, archbishops, bishops, and the heads of major religious houses were themselves significant landowners and feudal lords whose material interests were closely aligned with those of the lay baronage in resisting excessive royal fiscal exploitation, and they regularly participated in the baronial coalitions that produced the major constitutional confrontations of the period. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose appointment had been the occasion for John's dispute with Innocent III, played a crucial role in the negotiations that produced Magna Carta in 1215, bringing to those negotiations both the moral authority of his ecclesiastical office and the intellectual resources of a highly educated theologian who had spent decades in Paris engaging with the most sophisticated political thought available in the early 13th century. The theological tradition that Langton and other church intellectuals had absorbed, with its emphasis on the contractual character of political authority, the obligation of rulers to govern for the common good, rather than merely their own benefit, and the legitimacy of resistance to tyranny, provided the intellectual framework within which the baronial constitutional demands of the Plantagenet period were articulated and justified. The Church's role as the primary custodian of literacy and learning in medieval society meant that it was churchmen who produced the chronicles and administrative records through which the constitutional history of the period was documented and transmitted, and their perspectives inevitably shaped the ways in which subsequent generations understood and drew upon that history. The monastic chroniclers, who recorded the events of the anarchy, the Becket controversy, the sealing of Magna Carta, and the constitutional struggles of the 13th and 14th centuries, were not neutral observers, but participants in a culture that had developed sophisticated ideas about the obligations of kingship and the rights of subjects. And their accounts reflected those ideas in ways that influenced the subsequent reading of the medieval constitutional record. The specific contribution of the English common lawyers to the development of constitutional thought deserves examination as a distinct element of the Plantagenet legacy. The professional community of lawyers that had grown up around the royal courts during the Plantagenet period had developed by the late 14th and 15th centuries, a distinctive intellectual culture centered on the systematic analysis and elaboration of common law rules and principles, and this culture had embedded within it certain constitutional assumptions about the relationship between royal authority and legal constraint that would prove extraordinarily influential on subsequent political thought. The common lawyers understood the law not as the expression of royal will, but as a system of rules with its own internal logic and its own authority derived from the accumulated wisdom of past judicial decisions, and they consistently resisted the idea that the king could simply override established legal rules by the exercise of royal prerogative. This professional commitment to the independence and supremacy of the common law, rooted in the institutional interests of a legal profession whose authority depended on the laws being something distinct from, and not merely, the derivative of royal command, generated a tradition of legal thought that provided the primary intellectual foundation for 17th century constitutional resistance to Stuart absolutism. The common lawyers who argued in the parliamentary debates of the 1620s and 30s against Charles I's claims to extra-parliamentary taxation and arbitrary imprisonment were drawing on a tradition of legal argument whose roots extended back through the yearbooks, the records of common law pleading that had been accumulating since the late 13th century, to the foundational legal reforms of the Plantagenet period itself. The continuity between the 12th century administrative innovations of Henry II and the 17th century constitutional arguments of Edward Coke was not a matter of mere historical coincidence, but reflected the stumbling, genuine institutional and intellectual transmission of a legal tradition that had maintained its essential commitments across the centuries of its development. The contribution of individual Plantagenet queens and noble women to the political and cultural history of the period represents an element of the Plantagenet legacy that deserves recognition alongside the more conventionally acknowledged achievements of the male figures who dominated the political narrative. Eleanor of Aquitaine's role as a cultural patron and political actor, Eleanor of Provence's influence on Henry III's government, Eleanor of Castile, whose death prompted Edward I to erect the Eleanor crosses that marked the stages of her funeral journey from Lincolnshire to Westminster, and that remain among the finest examples of 13th century English monumental sculpture. Margaret of Anjou's formidable political leadership during the Wars of the Roses, and the various noble women who managed estates, conducted legal business, and exercised local authority during their husbands' absences on military or governmental service, all demonstrate the degree to which women participated in the political and cultural life of the Plantagenet period within the constraints that its patriarchal social structure imposed. The legal position of women in Plantagenet England was shaped by the common law's evolving treatment of female property rights and legal capacity. The concept of coverture, which absorbed a married woman's legal identity into that of her husband, limiting her ability to own property or conduct legal business independently, coexisted with various practical arrangements that allowed women of the propertied classes to exercise considerable economic and social agency within those formal constraints. The widows of wealthy men enjoyed significantly greater legal autonomy than married women, and the Plantagenet records are full of examples of widows managing substantial estates, conducting complex legal negotiations, and exercising significant local authority in ways that demonstrate the gap between the formal legal disabilities imposed by coverture and the practical realities of women's lives in medieval English society. The specific provisions of Magna Carta that addressed the rights of widows, prohibiting the king from compelling them to remarry against their will and guaranteeing their right to their dower portions, reflected both the vulnerability of widows as potential objects of royal exploitation and the recognition that their property rights deserved formal legal protection, and these provisions contributed to the developing common law tradition governing women's property rights that elaborated significantly during the course of the Plantagenet centuries. The relationship between the Plantagenet dynasty and the Jewish communities of medieval England represents a dimension of the dynasty's legacy that is both historically significant and deeply troubling in its implications. The Jews of England, whose presence in the country had been encouraged by William the Conqueror and his Norman successors as a source of credit and financial services that the Church's prohibition on usury made difficult to obtain from Christian sources, occupied a legally anomalous position in Plantagenet England as the direct subjects of the crown, protected in theory by royal authority, but vulnerable in practice to the exploitation and violence that their economic role as moneylenders generated among those who owed them money. The royal government exploited Jewish communities systematically throughout the Plantagenet period through special taxes, forced loans, and the confiscation of Jewish wealth. The exchequer of the Jews, that managed the crown's financial relationship with the Jewish community, represented a mechanism for systematic extraction rather than genuine protection. The violence that accompanied the crusading enthusiasm of Richard I's reign, the local massacres that occurred at Lynn, Stamford, Lincoln, and most horrifyingly at York in 1190, where the Jewish community of that city chose collective death in Clifford's Tower rather than surrender to a murderous mob, reflected the extreme vulnerability of Jewish communities when royal protection was absent or inadequate. The expulsion of the Jews from England by Edward I in 1290, which removed the entire Jewish population of approximately 2,000 people from the country and confiscated their remaining assets for the crown, represented the culmination of a century and a half of systematic exploitation and periodic violence, and the fact that England remained without a legally resident Jewish community for nearly 4 centuries until Oliver Cromwell's effective readmission of Jewish settlers in 1656 represents one of the most significant negative consequences of Plantagenet governance for a specific social group. The expulsion reflected both the fiscal calculation that the Jewish communities had been sufficiently exploited that they had little remaining economic value to the crown, and the political calculation that the popularity of expulsion among the debtor classes who owed money to Jewish creditors could generate political support for the royal government, demonstrating the degree to which even the most vulnerable minority populations were subject to the purely instrumental calculations of medieval royal politics. The relationship between the Plantagenet dynasty and the broader the world of medieval culture and politics extended beyond the immediate questions of territorial control and military conflict to encompass intellectual, artistic, and religious connections that reflected England's participation in the common culture of Latin Christendom, while simultaneously developing the distinctive national characteristics that made English medieval civilization identifiably different from its continental counterparts. The English contribution to the broader cultural achievements of the medieval period in theology, in philosophy, in natural science, in literature, and in the visual and architectural arts was shaped throughout the Plantagenet centuries by the tension between participation in the universal culture of the Church and the development of specifically English forms of expression. Intellectual inquiry. The theological tradition associated with Oxford, with figures like Robert Grosseteste in the 13th century, whose engagement with Aristotelian natural philosophy helped establish the empirical approach to natural inquiry that would eventually generate the scientific revolution, and Roger Bacon, whose extraordinary range of intellectual curiosity encompassed mathematics, optics, experimental science, and linguistic scholarship in ways that made him one of the most remarkable minds of the medieval period, developed its distinctive character, partly through its engagement with the continental intellectual currents that flowed through the universities and monasteries of medieval Europe, and partly through the specific intellectual environment that Plantagenet England provided. The development of English mystical theology in the 14th century, represented by figures like Richard Rolle, Walter Hilton, Julian of Norwich, and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, created a tradition of contemplative writing of extraordinary psychological depth and spiritual sophistication that reflected both the influence of continental mystical currents and the specific character of English religious culture that the Plantagenet period had shaped. The specific contribution of the Plantagenet period to the development of English geographical and cartographic knowledge reflects the dynasty's engagement with the wider world through trade, crusade, pilgrimage, and diplomacy in ways that expanded English understanding of the physical world beyond the island kingdom. The Mappa Mundi produced at Hereford Cathedral in approximately 1285, the largest surviving medieval map of the world and one of the most extraordinary intellectual artifacts of the Plantagenet period, encapsulates in its extraordinary synthesis of geographical, theological, historical, and mythological knowledge the characteristic intellectual culture of 13th century England, combining practical geographical information derived from actual travel and trade with the theological understanding of world geography as a text in which divine providence expressed itself through the ordering of human and natural history. The map's orientation with Jerusalem at its center and east at the top, its inclusion of both real geographical features derived from travelers' accounts and mythological creatures and places derived from ancient literary and theological tradition, and its integration of historical and contemporary geographical knowledge reflect the comprehensive ambition of medieval cartography to represent not merely the physical configuration of the Earth's surface, but the full meaning of the world as a divinely ordered creation. The practical geographical knowledge that English travellers, merchants, and crusaders accumulated during the Plantagenet period contributed to the expanding cartographic tradition, and the diplomatic contacts that English royal government maintained with distant powers with the Mongol Empire through the friars sent eastward in the 13th century, with the Byzantine Empire and the various powers of the Mediterranean world through crusading and commercial contacts brought into English consciousness awareness of a wider world whose dimensions continued expanding throughout the Plantagenet centuries. The legacy of the Plantagenet period in shaping the ceremonial and symbolic dimensions of English kingship extended to the specific objects and rituals through which royal authority was represented, communicated to contemporaries. The regalia of English kingship, the crown, the sceptre, the orb, the sword of state, and the other objects employed in the coronation ceremony were developed and elaborated throughout the Plantagenet period, with each generation adding to and modifying the symbolic vocabulary through which the royal office expressed its character and claimed its authority. The specific objects employed in English coronation ceremonies acquired their established forms primarily during the Plantagenet centuries, and the theological interpretation of the coronation ritual, with its anointing ceremony modelled on the anointing of Old Testament kings, and its elaborate presentation of the regalia, was developed and expounded by theologians and court intellectuals who understood the ceremony as simultaneously a political event and a sacramental act conferring divine authorization on the royal office. The coronation oath, whose specific formulation evolved throughout the Plantagenet period, expressed in its developing language the changing constitutional assumptions about the obligations of kingship, the promise to preserve the rights of the Church, to do justice to all people according to law, and to maintain the customs and laws of the kingdom, and the modifications introduced at different coronations reflected the specific political circumstances of each reign's beginning and the constitutional lessons that recent crises had generated. The Stone of Scone, brought to Westminster by Edward I following his conquest of Scotland, and placed beneath the coronation throne where it remained for subsequent English and British coronations, represented both the territorial ambitions of the Plantagenet imperial programme and the symbolic importance attached to specific material objects as vehicles of royal and national identity. Its return to Scotland in 1996, reflecting the continuing political resonance of these medieval symbolic investments in a world that had been transformed beyond anything Edward I could have imagined. The enduring fascination that the Plantagenet period exercises over subsequent generations, expressed in the extraordinary popularity of historical fiction and drama set in the medieval English court, in the tourism that the great castles and cathedrals of the Plantagenet period continue to attract, in the scholarly literature that continues expanding our understanding of medieval English history, and in the political invocations of medieval constitutional precedents that continue occurring in debates about the nature of legitimate governance, reflects something genuine about the period's historical significance and about the ways in which its legacy continues shaping the world we inhabit. The Plantagenet story speaks to permanent features of human political experience, the tension between authority and liberty, the difficulty of constructing institutions capable of constraining the arbitrary exercise of power while preserving the capacity for effective governance, the ways in which personal character and circumstance interact with structural forces to produce historical outcomes that could have been different and that generate consequences extending far beyond anyone's intentions. Foresight. These themes give the Plantagenet story a resonance that transcends the specific historical circumstances of medieval England, making it genuinely instructive for understanding the challenges of political life in any age and in any society that grapples with the fundamental questions of how power should be organized, constrained, and exercised in the service of justice rather than merely in the service of those who hold it. The 3.5 centuries of Plantagenet rule that shaped the English kingdom from the accession of Henry II in 1154 to the death of Richard III at Bosworth in 1485 represent one of the most consequential periods in the political history of the world, and their legacy in the institutions, the legal systems, the constitutional principles, and the political cultures that they helped to create continues as a living presence in the world that their story did so much to shape. The material culture of the Plantagenet period, expressed not merely in the great public monuments of cathedral and castle, but in the objects of daily life, the products of craft, workshops, and the accumulated material evidence of how ordinary and extraordinary people actually lived, provides dimensions of historical understanding that the political and constitutional narrative alone cannot supply. Archaeological investigation of Plantagenet period sites throughout England has revealed over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries a material world of considerable complexity and sophistication, demonstrating that the civilization the dynasty presided over was not merely institutionally and intellectually rich, but materially productive in ways that created the economic foundation for its cultural achievements. The pottery, metalwork, textiles, leather goods, and food remains recovered from urban excavations in London, Winchester, York, Lincoln, and dozens of other English towns and cities document the daily economic life of medieval communities whose commercial activity generated the surplus wealth that funded the great building programs, supported the royal administration, and sustained the legal and educational institutions through which the Plantagenet period's most durable achievements were created. The evidence of long-distance trade visible in the distribution of imported ceramics, metalwork, and other goods recovered from archaeological contexts throughout England demonstrates the degree to which even relatively modest English communities were integrated into international commercial networks extending across Western Europe and beyond. And this commercial integration created both the economic prosperity and the cultural cosmopolitanism that characterized the Plantagenet period at its most successful. The specific character of English urban life during the Plantagenet centuries, revealed through the combination of documentary and archaeological evidence that the period has left in unusual abundance, reflects the distinctive social dynamics of a society in which the commercial classes of the towns were acquiring increasing economic importance and developing the institutional frameworks, guild organizations, borough charters, elected municipal governments through which they managed their own affairs and articulated their interests to the royal government. The borough charters that successive Plantagenet monarchs granted to English towns in exchange for financial payments represented not merely administrative arrangements, but the formal recognition of urban communities as distinct legal entities with collective rights and privileges that distinguished them from the surrounding rural society. And the accumulation of these chartered rights over the Plantagenet centuries created the institutional foundations for English urban governance that would persist through the early modern period and beyond. The guild system that organized craft production and commercial activity in English towns developed its mature medieval form during the Plantagenet centuries, creating the regulatory frameworks through which product quality was maintained, commercial practices were standardized, and the interests of established practitioners were protected against competition from outsiders. The wealth that commercial success generated for the leading families of English medieval towns found expression not merely in private consumption, but in the patronage of religious institutions, the endowment of charitable foundations, and the construction of the great merchant churches whose towers still dominate the skylines of many English towns and cities, creating a visible architectural legacy of the commercial prosperity that the Plantagenet period's trading networks had generated. The specific contribution of the Plantagenet period to the development of English musical culture represents a dimension of the dynasty's cultural legacy that the more immediately visible achievements of literature and architecture sometimes overshadow. The development of polyphonic music, the composition and performance of music in multiple independent voices rather than the single melodic line of earlier plainchant, occurred during the Plantagenet centuries in ways that made English musical culture a significant contributor to the broader European development of what would eventually become the Western classical tradition. The Worcester fragments, the Old Hall manuscript, and other collections of English medieval polyphonic music that survive from the Plantagenet period demonstrate the sophistication of English musical composition and the degree to which English musicians were participating in, contributing to the international musical culture of medieval Christendom. The specific qualities of the English musical tradition, its characteristic preference for thirds and sixths as consonant intervals, its development of the carol form, and its elaboration of the cantus firmus technique, in which a pre-existing melody provided the structural foundation for more elaborate polyphonic composition, created a distinctive national musical identity that continental musicians recognized and admired, and that contributed to the broader development of European musical culture in ways whose influence extended far beyond the medieval period. The musical establishments of the great English cathedrals and royal chapels, sustained throughout the Plantagenet period by the financial resources of royal and aristocratic patronage, created institutional frameworks for musical performance and composition that maintained the continuity of English musical culture across the political disruptions of the dynastic conflicts, and that provided the foundation on which the extraordinary flowering of English Renaissance music under the Tudor monarchs would build. The Chapel Royal, whose origins lay in the Plantagenet period's development of royal household institutions, became, during the 15th and 16th centuries, one of the most musically distinguished institutions in Europe, attracting and developing composers of the first rank and creating the performance environment in which English musical culture achieved its greatest medieval and early modern achievements, demonstrating once again the remarkable persistence and productivity of the institutional foundations that the Plantagenet centuries had established. The legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty, considered across the full range of its institutional, legal, cultural, architectural, musical, and political dimensions, ultimately presents itself not as a coherent designed achievement, but as the complex and partially unintended product of 3.5 centuries of human ambition, conflict, creativity, and failure operating within the specific circumstances of medieval English society. The dynasty that Henry II founded when he ended the anarchy in 1154 and began his extraordinary program of administrative reform could not have foreseen that the institutions it was creating would eventually provide the constitutional foundations for political traditions extending across the globe, that the legal system it was developing would shape the governance of nations not yet imagined, or that the cultural achievements of the civilization it presided over would continue generating wonder and scholarly inquiry more than 8 centuries after its final representative died on a battlefield in Leicestershire. The Plantagenet story, in its full complexity and consequence, remains one of the most instructive and most compelling narratives in the entire history of human political development, a testament to the extraordinary capacity of historical circumstance when combined with human intelligence and human conflict in the right institutional environment, to generate consequences that transcend the intentions of any of the individuals involved and that continue shaping the possibilities of human life across centuries of transformation that those individuals could never have conceived.